When I covered Alan Wake the first time back in 2017, I didn't quite get it. I enjoyed but didn't love the rhythm of the game. I wasn't completely on board with its metatextuality and its peculiar tone. I just couldn't find my way around to an appreciation of what the deal was here, exactly. Alan Wake 2 changed my mind. Back then, I didn't even think there would be an Alan Wake 2, let alone that it would be one of the most creatively unique horror games ever made. It was so good that I decided that instead of reviewing it alone, I needed to come back and revisit the whole series. Alan Wake 2 recontextualized my previous experience, and with that new framework, I was finally ready to accept what the previous games were trying to accomplish. And, to be honest, the ironic resonance of revisiting my own writing in a game about a writer trying to escape a prison of his own words was just too goddamn delightful to resist. The Alan Wake games are some of the most complexly metatextual works of art ever released, so the opportunity to metatextually participate in them, well, what writer could resist? More than personal reasons, though, it was important for me to revisit the games as a critic because the Alan Wake games are not just part of the canon of the Remedy Universe games, they are the foundation of them. Every title that Remedy has done somehow circles back around to a connection to the Alan Wake titles. They are to Sam Lake and Remedy what the Dark Tower books are to Stephen King, the universe that connects the multiverse, the canvas on which the paintings are made. This, I think, is due to how the Alan Wake games are thematically constructed. Above all, they are a meditation on creativity and imagination. They are art about why we make art, what it means, how it helps us, how it hurts us, and whether or not stories have real power in a world that does not really care if we live or die. How do we construct meaning? Why do we seek meaning? In the Alan Wake universe, art and magic are indistinguishable. It's the only way in which people can conjure up something from nothing, create lives out of thin air, turn reality into dreams, and vice versa. Sure, it would help if Alan Wake 1 was a little better as a game, but the second game is so preposterously good that it all kind of comes out in the wash. The frame, the setting, and the characters are all leading somewhere that evolves from title to title, sharpening their points, accumulating to something far beyond the destinations or shortcomings of an individual title. They represent something truly unique and indispensable in the medium of video games. It's not hard to find a game that's self-aware and self-referential. Breaking the fourth wall is easy to do. What's insanely hard, what Alan Wake is trying to do, is to not only break down the fourth wall, but rebuild it behind the audience, to enclose them within the story itself, creating a fiction where self-awareness is constructive instead of deconstructive. It seems to me that this couldn't be done outside of any genre but horror. Horror is a genre where imagination is made visceral and real. Literary and realistic fiction hinges on believability, relatability, taking truth and making it metaphorical. Science fiction and fantasy use imagination to explore ideas and characters, creating worlds beyond our own, where we can see some facet of the familiar reflected back in a way that's novel or surprising. Horror isn't about ideas or truth. It is about emotion, deep and ancient animal emotions left over in the part of the body that remembers all those eons of being cold and alone in the endless dark woods. Horror is about confrontation, with monsters, but also with the self, with the parts of us that are ugly, the parts that scare us, the parts that hurt others or hurt ourselves. In horror, we take our own darkness and make it manifest in the world through fiction so that we might better know how to overcome it, which is, after all, the exact plot of Alan Wake. Alan Wake 1 is simultaneously structured as a Stephen King novel about a novelist, of which there are many, and a mid-budget TV miniseries adaptation of a Stephen King novel, of which there are arguably even more. The 10-hour game is divided into 6 long, meandering episodes where the storytelling is largely bookended to an inciting event at the beginning, a cliffhanger at the end, and a whole lot of gameplay in the middle. It helps establish Alan Wake as a truly mixed medium affair. It is about writing, but also about filmmaking, and then also about video gaming. In classic Remedy style, there are snippets of a weird television show scattered throughout, just like in Max Payne. This time, it's Night Springs, a Twilight Zone-adjacent piece of media about some sort of bizarre setup with an ironic resolution told using live actors within the digital world for a little pop of uncanny contrast. The Night Springs shows are how the Alan Wake game is meant to be viewed, not as something entirely serious, but something campy that has serious things to say anyway, along the way, while we're all goofing around a little and having fun. Alan Wake the character was a writer for Night Springs, after all. They are reflections of each other. The game episodes are all very long, however, with many different phases and unusually winding, stretched-out level design. Episode 1 starts with a dream tutorial that establishes the game's relationship with horror tropes and cliches right off the bat. Alan Wake begrudgingly admits, yes, so it starts with a dream. Driving his car along a winding mountain road, he hits somebody. The body disappears and then reappears as an axe-wielding murderer from one of his stories. A murderer who immediately starts calling Alan a fucking hack, a shithead writer who can't do anything original or well. He literally says, quote, "Cheap thrills and pretentious shit. Look at me. Look at your work." End quote. Well, all right then. If the game genuinely thought a poorly lit man with an axe was all it took to be scary, it would indeed be in hack territory. But instead, it is starting off with a cliché in order to completely flip the cliché upside down and fuck with it, to fuck with Alan. Put the game on a metatextual footing from minute 2. The tutorial does stuff like teach you how to shoot and other basic video game things, but it also establishes the visual language of the broader conflict and of the mechanical combat. Darkness and light, a ravenous, insatiable hunger, and pockets of safety. And it includes a visit from Thomas Zane, the poet. Or is it Thomas Zane, the filmmaker? He recites a poem that foreshadows the ending, but he is also himself foreshadowed by a poster for a film called Tom the Poet. Zane's relationship to Alan is deeply curious and confusing, lasting all the way through Alan Wake 2 without truly definitive answers. But truly definitive answers are not really the point. In addition to starting with a dream, the game starts with a quote from Stephen King that goes, quote, "Nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They are antithetical to the poetry of fear." End quote. Zane's relationship to this quote is worth considering as the game goes on because it is not entirely clear if Alan Wake is his own person or if he is, in fact, an imaginative creation of Thomas Zane. Because Zane's specialty is film, is this why the Alan Wake game is presented in a television show format? If this story is being told by a writer he invented in a desperate attempt to switch the mediums of his world-altering magic, then is Tom the Poet writing the poetry of fear with his horror tale? Part of the joy of the Alan Wake series is that it is full of recursive loops of reference, like Night Springs being a creation of Alan, but also a reflection of the game's tonality. It becomes incredibly tricky to sort out the layers of fiction because there are always multiple threads of possibility and causality running at the same time. Part of what makes Alan Wake so uncertain in his own reality as a character is how closely he resembles the writer-characters of Stephen King. He is a writer's idea of a writer, like Paul Sheldon in Misery or Tad Beaumont from The Dark Half. As the game truly opens, as Alan wakes from his initial dream, he is on the ferry with his wife Alice to the sleepy town of Bright Falls, Washington. He's trying to take a breather because for the past 2 years, following the success of his last hard-boiled crime novel, The Sudden Stop, he can't bring himself to write. He has become increasingly angry, drunk, and sullen within his marriage. His wife Alice has brought him here in an attempt to repair his career and the growing distance between them. While stopping in at the Oh Dear Diner to get the keys to their rental cabin, a dark presence intervenes. Thomas Zane's old flame, Barbara Yeager, replaces them with keys to Tom's cabin, which was, of course, destroyed years ago, but no matter, the spell has begun. They are over the threshold already. Alice gives him the gift of a typewriter, and Alan loses his shit about it. He storms out, knowing that since Alice is afraid of the dark, she will not follow him, which is such a shitty thing to do. Alan Wake is a deeply selfish person, egotistical and sometimes cruel, which becomes more notable later on. Yeager pulls Alice down into Cauldron Lake, under the waters of the creative unconscious, to hold her captive and drown her. When Alan follows, Yeager forces him to write his new book, Departure, a story about how the darkness that consumed Tom and Barbara will consume the whole world. What Alan does to resist is to refuse to write an ending. When he wakes up in his crashed Lincoln SUV, he is starting down a path of predestination with himself as the heroic fool at the heart of it all, a parade of cheap thrills and pretentious shit with only the slimmest glimmer of hope waiting at the end. Part of what's so compelling about Alan Wake is that although it plays a long and complicated game with its narrative, the essential combat loop and rhythm of play is dead simple. It all revolves around darkness and light. All enemies are taken by darkness, which covers them like a shroud. The shroud must be burned away with a flashlight before you can do damage, and then your weapons make surprisingly fast work of them. Ammunition and flashlight batteries are separate resources, and there are environmental opportunities to save both, like explosive barrels or work lights that can be turned on. Burning down an enemy's shield takes a while and also slows them when they advance. If they touch you, they will do a fair bit of damage. It is hugely important then that they don't get close, but they all move pretty quick. One-on-one, the Taken are not particularly dangerous, but you never really fight them one-on-one unless they're an especially burly bastard. Instead, they come at you in groups, and the player is expected to juggle them. Focusing on just one Taken until the darkness is dispelled gives the other Taken ample time to close in and mess you up. You need to pivot your attention from one to another, reposition constantly to keep away from the pack, and have a certain amount of patience while the danger closes in. This creates a fantastic sense of tension, helped out by the UI choice to make burning the darkness way indicated by a circle that slowly closes and then snaps in a shimmer of light. Once that snap happens, you can fire, which is another pop of brightness accompanied by very satisfying feedback, a sudden release and reversal of the tension that has been built. This push-pull of defensive tactics with sudden aggressive reversals is unlike a lot of survival horror titles. It has more elasticity. It is faster-paced and more action-oriented. But because all combat begins from a position of disempowerment with all of your foes shielded from damage, it does not feel like an action game. It is not about crushing your opponents so much as outfoxing or outpacing them. For this reason, the most memorable encounter design is usually centered around wave defense. You have some sort of smaller area with a few clear choke points and just absolute heaps of Taken, generally 3 to 7 at a time, sometimes more later on. For situations like this, when you are deliberately overwhelmed, the game has a number of emergency tools. The most basic is the flare. Pop one off and everybody backs off for a second. A player can dodge, which if you get the timing right slows down time with a satisfying little flourish, but the flare is another kind of dodge, in effect. It just immediately offers instant reprieve for a few vital seconds, but not too many seconds. It's never enough to blast the darkness off of more than 1 or 2 Taken, and if you need the flare, there's probably quite a few more than that. The flare gun, on the other hand, is an instant fuck you I win weapon. Not only does it kill whatever it hits, it has a huge blast radius that takes down everything around the point of impact. Ammunition for this is usually only available from torchbearer supply caches that are hidden around every level. You are rewarded for exploration with a kind of combat bypass option. Plus, the camera follows the flare on its trajectory when you land a hit, which just gives an extra oomph and makes it a thrill. Flashbang grenades are an alternative to the handheld flares that do the same thing as the flare gun, a big instant kill, but they take a couple of seconds to explode. The timing needs to be right, or else you need to pop one and retreat. The first appearance of an enemy pack, and then the final kill of any encounter, also triggers a cinematic slowdown effect, which punctuates the rhythm and lets a player know when exploration ends and begins again. There is never an unclear moment about when you are in immediate danger. Survival horror games don't always make these distinctions. They usually want to create an impression that you are always in immediate danger. And usually it's true. Alan Wake 2 is like that. It reconfigures the combat loop to be slower, more brutal, more dangerous, with fewer distinctions between traversal and combat. As it stands, Alan Wake 1's combat does shift the vibe of the game away from pure horror or survival horror. It is more akin to supernatural thriller. There is tension, but not terror, dread, but not despair. Though it is still able to maintain a distinction from a straight-up action title, not just because of the flashlight darkness mechanic, but also because of the relentlessness of the combat encounter design. The dark presence is overwhelmingly powerful, and Alan is always 2 steps behind. If you wander too far off the path into the woods, the game seems to always spawn extra enemies to punish you for it. And it also makes the interesting choice to constantly take away your arsenal. You don't ever hold on to your inventory for very long. Every episode is a restart and a refresh, and often you get things shaken up midway through an episode as well. One notable sequence has you advancing for a while only using flashbangs, necessitating you catch the whole enemy group in the blast so you don't run out of supplies prematurely. But even if you do run out of resources, you can always run. Even in the darkest, most difficult parts of the game, you can dodge and sprint your way through to the next brilliant pool of light, where your game will be saved, your health will be restored, and the enemies will be deflected. You can begin anew in some small capacity. Alan doesn't have to be the best. He doesn't have to win. He just needs to reach his ending. In most games, if it takes you 2 hours to get somewhere, it's because you're in some sort of an open world with a ton of distractions along the way. Yes, you have to get to Goal A, but what about Enemy Outpost B, Radio Tower C, Collectibles D through H? It's rare for a game to present a singular winding path that is so extensive and time-consuming as the level design here in Alan Wake 1. This amount of decompression does a couple of meaningful things to the tone and pacing of the game. The first is that it creates a naturalistic sense of space. So often in a horror game, the deep, dark woods will be like 20 feet and then a fence line, a suggestion of a space without being actionable. True open worlds are hard to make work for horror titles. I can't really even think of any that try. Being able to approach a goal from any direction or try any method usually short-circuits the kind of tight, curated encounter design that horror titles try to create. They are, instead, the realm of action games and RPGs and blends of the two. Alan Wake creates pretty narrow corridors of usable space throughout a vast wilderness, but they go on for so long and in such meandering ways that they do a considerably better job of conveying the space than just a few vistas. It is literally the opposite of how Alan Wake 2 does it, where the maps are very condensed and imply larger areas than they are. A lot of research was done to get the sights and sounds of the Pacific Northwest forests down correctly, and they really do feel like Washington. Creating a sense of naturalistic space heightens what the supernatural elements are trying to accomplish. It makes the whole thing feel more uncanny, more oppressive. When it takes 15 minutes to cross through a wilderness, it can't really convey being lost very well. You'd be more lost on a paved nature loop. In Alan Wake 1, when it's an hour or more up the mountain, down the mountain, across a valley, among the trees and fog through an endless stream of shadowy enemies, that creates a genuine and pressing sense of isolation. Ideally, anyway. It can also create a sense of monotony if it's not careful. The remastered version of the game is better at alleviating this monotony because the lighting is sharper, the textures are crisper, it's just an altogether more scenic experience than it was originally, and when it comes to making natural spaces feel natural, that counts for a lot. Seeing a speck of neon way, way off in the distance and knowing that you've got to make your way towards it in the most circuitous way possible lets that distance mean something. Limiting the playable space to long outdoor doors instead of an open world also makes collectible hunting feel a lot more manageable. Scattered throughout the world are pages of departure, which gives foreshadowing for what's about to come and extra insight into characters with scenes that you aren't present for. The only negative thing is that some pages aren't available unless you're playing on Nightmare difficulty. Finding the pages feels deeply important to the story. Kind of is the story, really. And some of them are hidden quite deeply. The path doesn't always go in one direction, often it branches, but one way leads forward and the other is a dead end that leads to either a manuscript page or a cache. There are also 100 Oh Dear Diner coffee thermoses scattered throughout, but I have never had the heart for a scavenger hunt like that. Finding all 100 sounds to me like just a miserable pain in the ass. I did find like 80 or so just exploring around though, so maybe it's not that hard. What surprised me is that I missed a lot of the caches, and I thought I was being pretty thorough. Some must be quite well hidden. Where the scale of the maps begins to get kind of absurd is when putting one foot in front of another is no longer enough, and the game introduces vehicle segments. With a whole bunch of different kinds of vehicles, with different handling qualities. It is almost entirely superfluous. It's kind of an astounding amount of developmental effort that goes into a constellation of game mechanics that only come up occasionally and don't add much of anything to the atmosphere that a cutscene wouldn't have accomplished just fine. And I say that as someone who genuinely values interactivity in storytelling, scenic use of game space, and car culture. It just doesn't contribute, although it can be fun to stop and explore some of the little optional locations along the way. The only time it kind of matters to drive is at the climax in Episode 6, where you are trying to get back to Cauldron Lake as quickly as possible and need to go many miles through the unnatural dark. The length of the traversal there in the climax, trying to go for an automotive odyssey kind of vibe, makes narrative sense, but it still doesn't make a lot of mechanical sense or feel right. It just isn't as tense to be running overtaken in a truck as it is to be alone and vulnerable on foot. Which you have to do anyway because of the many roadblocks in Episode 6. It's just not cohesive, although I suppose it is ambitious. The underlying point of it is to make Bright Falls and its surrounding areas as much of a character as Alan, or Rose, or Sheriff Breaker. The sense of this world being real is what allows the sense of reality being unwound to transpire. The horror cannot function if it is not undermining some kind of normalcy. And Alan Wake is very, very good at crafting a sense of normalcy. So much so that when the game suggests that Alan is having a mental health breakdown and making the whole damn thing up, this sounds pretty reasonable. Dr. Emil Hartman is one of the best minor villains in the series because he is a familiar enemy of any professional artist. A producer. Hartman is a psychiatrist who, lacking any artistic talent himself, cultivates relationships with artists to try and manipulate them and their work to further his own fame and profit. He has a unique position in the deep lore, too, because he was a friend of Thomas Zane's back in the 70s. When the darkness of Cauldron Lake killed Barbara Yager and ruined Zane's life, Hartman convinced him that he should use the power of his art to bring Yeager back. And, of course, she came back wrong. A manuscript page describes Zane donning the dive suit that you see him in and stepping off the dock of Diver's Isle with her corrupted body in his arms, both of them sinking into the black waters, down to the dark place. In a very real way, Hartman shares the blame for all the shit that's happening to Alan, to Bright Falls in general. But Hartman's suggestion that the events of the game are a narcissistic delusion on Alan's part rings surprisingly true. How could Alan be such an egotist to believe that he controls the lives of everyone in town through his writing? And all the taken, the bodies just, what, disappear? Alice is trapped under the lake by, who did you say, Baba Yaga, the witch? Be serious, Alan. Which is more likely, that the world is in supernatural danger, or that he's got an overactive imagination, a drinking problem, and a wildly inflated sense of importance after years of being a New York City big shot? I mean, I have a lot of these complaints about Alan myself. He's not likable, and he isn't meant to be. That's part of the Stephen King writing about writers trope, that the act of creation is in some way deeply presumptuous, and these people who think highly enough of themselves to do it are blind to their own egotism. It's something even I get in my comments section from time to time, people being like, wow, I can't believe you expect people to listen to you drone on and on with your inane blather. What a fuckhead. And I suppose it's true. I would not be here on YouTube if I did not derive some kind of satisfaction from having my voice heard. I do like it. Stephen King himself took the writing about writers trope so far that in his magnum opus Dark Tower series, he wrote himself into the story and had his own characters meet him. The Dark Tower books were always about King on some level anyway, with their contemplative and personal forwards and afterwards, and his insistence on joining well over half his other fiction into the series in some way large or small, so having him weigh in on his own creation within his creation isn't 100% as out of place as it might feel on the surface of it. But, wow, is it ever an Alan Wake move, and worth diving into briefly. To clarify a couple of terms King uses, ka means fate and serves for a kind of predestination. Gan is a kind of informal word for God, and dis stands for the forces of entropy, chaos, and despair. Anyway, from Song of Susanna, quote, "What happens when you make a story?" Roland inquired. "My story, for instance." "It just comes," King said. His voice had grown faint, bemused. "It blows into me. That's the good part. And then it comes out when I move my fingers. Never from the head. Comes out the navel or somewhere. I'm gone, or possessed by gone. I don't know which. Maybe there's no difference." King began to cry. His tears were silent and horrible. "But it's not dis. I repudiate dis, and that should be enough, but it's not. Ka is never satisfied. Greedy old Ka, that's what she said, wasn't it? What Susan Delgado said before you killed her, or I killed her, or Gon killed her? Greedy old Ka, how I hate it. Regardless of who killed her, I made her say that. For I hate it, so I do. I buck against Ka's goad and will until the day I go to the clearing at the end of the path. And still, Ka comes for me, comes from me. I translate it, am made to translate it. Ka flows out of my navel like a ribbon. I am not Ka. I am not the ribbon. It's just what comes through me, and I hate it. I hate it." End quote. To which Roland advises King to stop his snivelment. The perspective of "I'm God, but I hate it" is the egotistical dilemma that Alan Wake struggles with in every game. It is the central conflict of his character. It is the path that leads him on, to be declared at the end of Alan Wake 2 as the master of many worlds. I sure do wish he would stop his stifflement, though. It's unbecoming of such a lofty title. Hartman calling Wake out on it feels satisfying, but Hartman is a shitty little parasite who is just trying to convince Alan that he isn't doing magic with his writing so that Hartman can control the magic himself. There's a big and somewhat tedious subplot involving a man who says he's kidnapped Alice, but that's all Hartman's doing as well. The man is just a lackey who hates Alan because he's from the big city with his fancy wife and his fancy sports utility vehicle. If there's any major criticism I have of the plot of Alan Wake 1, it's that it spends far too much time on the kidnapper red herring. When the game pivots to Hartman, it picks up speed and interest quite a bit. It's also an opportunity to develop some of the side characters, especially Alice. She was the one who alerted Hartman to Alan coming in the first place. You can listen to the tapes where she talks about how much stress Alan is putting on the marriage with his inability to write, and the anger that inability provokes in him. She's loving, loyal, but there is only so much a spouse can reasonably put up with. It's interesting to consider that the reason she falls for Hartman's lies and Alan does not is that she wants to help and is actively searching for a solution, and Alan, by contrast, refuses all help and doesn't think it's anyone else's business at all. Notable, though, is how Hartman manipulates and condescends to other characters. There's a painter named Rudolph Lane who is sensitive to the magic of Cauldron Lake as well, but not nearly so interactive with it. Hartman says he's just an illustrator, not a real artist, not until his work takes a macabre turn as the darkness closes in. When Lane was just producing landscapes for his own happiness, he was of no value. Hartman literally cannot understand doing art for the joy of it. Creativity is not the goal to him. Success is. Therefore, any shortcut to success is worth taking, no matter how manipulative or immoral. It is an interesting foreshadowing of the current cultural moment where corporations are racing to replace artists with AI, a moment that Alan Wake 2 explicitly deconstructs using Rudolph Lane and his paintings in the Lake House DLC later on, building out these themes and story threads into a whole miniature sequel of its own. Though that's hardly the only thing Alan Wake 2 expands and builds off of from this chapter. There's also Tor and Odin, the Anderson brothers. They're aging rock stars whose band is called the Old Gods of Asgard, but because this is fiction and fiction does as it pleases, they actually are Norse gods. And I have never quite been able to figure out how I feel about that as a story beat. I think an important distinction to make is that in Alan Wake 2, the Anderson brothers are considerably less annoying. In both games, they are rambling, drunk old men who speak cryptic truths in between mouthfuls of nonsense, but in the second game they have a core of compassion and humanity, whereas in the first game it just seems like bit comedy. Comedy is a key component of a lot of horror, though. It's important to have contrast with the dark and tense moments to offer bright pops of relief. Plenty of horror leans more towards comedy than genuine scares. The Nightmare on Elm Street movies work this way because no one is supposed to be frightened when Freddy says, "Bon appetit, bitch!" But the imagery is always dark and unsettling in ways the script is not. The contrast and interplay of horror and comedy is an essential aspect of the genre, and since Alan Wake as a meta-narrative is fixated on the demands of genre, it makes sense to find it here. The Anderson Brothers farm has a sequence that illustrates this pretty well. There's a big stage with pyrotechnics ready to pop off for the band to practice their set. To progress, you trigger the show, and need to fight massive waves of Taken from up on stage as the music swells and fireworks pop off. The absurdity is genuinely hilarious. It is unabashedly fun, but it's also very tense because the level of threat is so extremely high. There's an achievement for completing the sequence without getting seriously injured, and only 11.5% of players have managed to do it. Being frightened, amused, and entertained by both emotions at the same time is a core vibe around which a huge amount of horror media revolves. Consider the Terrifier movies. They are ultra-violent and extremely cruel, but also cartoonish slapstick. Art the Clown actually is a clown. He is doing a bit for laughs. Whether you find it funny or not depends on your tolerance for fictional disembowelment. When I first played the game, I really disliked the game's explicit comedy relief character, Barry Wheeler. Barry is Alan's agent and manager, a familiar cliché of the nasally sidekick type. For some reason, though, I liked him a lot better this time around. He's completely ridiculous, but he's not a bad person. He's actually a better friend to Alan than Alan is to him, which is a solid and useful characterization to include. Plus, it gives Barry more credibility than Hartman when he deconstructs Alan a little bit. The scene where he imitates Alan while hiding behind his cardboard cutout is still raucously funny and had me laughing for a good minute. I'm not upset he only appears in emails in Alan Wake 2, but I have come around to him in Alan Wake 1, even if it gets a little tiring listening to him shout, "Al! Al!" so many damn times. Plus, all the Nightspring segments are generally funny as hell. My favorite one is the final one because it's lampooning the game itself. Two old women walk downstairs to the basement and encounter a gaping void in reality. A man shows up who reveals that this is fiction. He is the writer, and this is a plot hole. Didn't really think it through too hard. He says to the women, "Why don't you two ladies go upstairs while I figure out where I was going with this?" The tone is so hilarious, like, "Oh, oops, this was not a good episode. I was not cooking with this. Fuck." This is part of why I like all the Thomas Zane stuff so much, because I like the idea that Alan and Barry fall into their cliches because Zane himself is not a writer, or not a good writer anyway, so he had to get a better writer to get out of being trapped in the dark place. Like, the first proof you get at Hartman's artist retreat that he is lying to Alan is that there is a commemorative sundial to Zane with a line of poetry on it. "Beyond the shadow you settle for, there is a miracle illuminated." Is Alan the shadow and Zane the miracle? Or is reality the shadow and art the miracle? Thomas Zane, when he was being pursued by the Dark Presence in 1970, wrote himself out of reality as much as possible, with the exception that anything he stored in a special shoebox would persist. But he was not completely thorough. Scraps of him remain. He left the shoebox in the care of Cynthia Weaver, a woman who is obsessed with him. And I mean obsessed. She is the one who has been using the yellow paint and leaving all these torchbearer caches behind. She is to Zane in Alan Wake 1 what Rose the waitress is to Alan in Alan Wake 2, when Rose leaves all the lunchboxes with upgrade materials in them all over the place. But Cynthia also painted this basement in absolutely unhinged graffiti. She is not well. Inside her well-lit room, a shrine to Zane's shoebox and his last intact page, is an excerpt where Zane writes Alan as a child, where Alan is given an object of power called the clicker. In a flashback, Alan had already described the clicker to Alice in their New York apartment. He says his parents gave it to him when he was afraid of the dark, and he could use it to chase the monsters away. Alice, clever Alice, kind of disbelieves the story, says it sounds like something he made up. It's too on the nose, too sentimental, too hacky. Is it a coincidence then that this artifact is the one thing Alan needs to defeat Jaeger and the Dark Presence? The one thing he needs to complete what Zane started but could not finish? Is Alan the hack? Or does it only feel that way because Zane is? The first we ever see of Alan, he is in a dream where Tom reaches out to make contact from somewhere very far away. But there's also another element of metatextuality involved. Even if Alan the writer is the creation of Tom the poet, they are both, inarguably and explicitly, the invention of Sam Lake, creative director of Remedy Games. I don't mean explicitly just because Sam Lake is the writer who wrote The Writers. I mean explicitly because he's in it. He's here, in the game. Alex Casey, the protagonist of Wake's hard-boiled crime thrillers, is written in the exact same style as the narration in Max Payne, voiced by James McCaffrey, just like Max Payne was. At one point, Alan Wake has a flashback to waking up in his New York apartment, deeply hungover after a publicity tour party for the book in which he finally killed off Alex Casey, The Sudden Stop. Alice shows up with groceries and says to turn on the TV because there's an interview of his about to play. In it, Wake defends his bad boy reputation and his choice to move on from Alex Casey, that Casey was played out, that he wanted a departure into something new and creatively satisfying. The guest sitting next to Alan is Sam Lake, as himself, who the interviewer asks to do the Max Payne face, since Sam Lake famously provided his own face for the in-game model of Max Payne in Max Payne. The interviewer then thanks the band Poets of the Fall for being the musical guest, Poets of the Fall, of course, being the band that does all the music for Old Gods of Asgard in Alan Wake. Like Stephen King writing his own car accident in The Dark Tower because the car accident spurred him to actually finish writing the Dark Tower books before something happened to him and he couldn't finish, the lines between author and fiction are not just blurred within Alan Wake, they are erased. Alan Wake is not just about how fiction is a magical process of creation that can change reality, it is meditation on how fiction has already changed the reality of its creator. This is Sam Lake's departure from the action games he was expected to make. These are Sam Lake's thoughts on genre, authorship, fame, the value of art. While it is important to the integrity of the work that it stand on its own without him, just as the Dark Tower books don't revolve around King entirely even when he is written into the story and continue on largely without him for the grand finale, the Alan Wake games never lose track of their place as the connective tissue between all Remedy titles and their creator. We'll talk more about it when Sam Lake reappears in Alan Wake 2's Timebreaker DLC. But it's worth considering that the true progression of canonical lineage is that Sam, a good writer, created Tom, a bad writer, who created Alan, a mediocre writer. Alan and Sam both created Alex Casey, who is also Max Payne, who spent the entirety of Max Payne 2 coming to terms with the fact that he was probably a fictional character, which he also does in Alan Wake 2 as Alex Casey instead. Everybody clear? Okay, good, because for a minute there I was worried that it might be confusing. Alan Wake 1 was not nearly as popular of a game as Alan Wake 2 was, although it did pretty good numbers after being out for a while. But the first game really is pretty critical to the story for a lot of different reasons. The way the second game plays around with metatextuality is far more deft and interesting, but it's only able to do this because of the foundation laid down by the first game, by tying knots with plot threads that were already braided together. The callbacks and references to things like Deerfest don't hit as well if you haven't played the first game. If this is a spiral of causality, the marble needs to roll slowly through the outer loops before it reaches speed in the tighter inner loops. Most importantly, though, is that Alan experiences meaningful character growth in the first game, growth without which the emotional arc of the second game would fall flat. A horror story cannot have an ending where everyone is safe, where everything works out great. Someone has to suffer. Someone has to pay the price. And if that isn't Alice, it will have to be Alan. He is such an insufferable, pompous ass in the beginning of the game, partly for the impact of seeing him decenter himself so that Alice can live. She was only taken in the first place because he was unable to accept her help as anything but an attack on his ego. The typewriter she bought him was an act of kindness, but to him it was an indictment. A word machine for someone who has not written a word in 2 years. A judgment. An accusation. Perhaps that's why the darkness was able to flow out of it so easily. It was already ribboned with the ink of his anger and spite. He begins not caring about anyone but himself, but he ends by caring quite a bit about almost all of the other side characters, particularly Barry and Sheriff Breaker. The best level in the game is arguably Episode 5, where he and the Sheriff fight off the Taken together across the town of Bright Falls. Switching from a natural landscape to the town is a welcome vibe shift. It feels climactic. What has been creeping up from the edges is now striking at the very center of things and poisoning it. Deerfest preparations in the background give everything a sly edge of irony, this ancient supernatural evil usurping the goofiest possible small-town celebration. But the other thing that's so satisfying about Episode 5 is that it is an end to Alan's perpetual isolation. Barry and Sarah are with him almost the entire time, if not right next to him, then at least over the radio. At this point, Alan's story is accepted by most of the characters. They are willing to help. The one character who doesn't want to help is taken by the Dark Presence at the beginning of the episode, not to appear again until the opening of Alan Wake 2, FBI Special Agent Nightingale. He's the worst character in the game because he makes no sense. He is irrationally hot-headed and aggressive. All the other characters even remark on how weirdly unhinged he is. Hacky writing. Perhaps a sign that he is an invention of Alan's script, part of the genre rules that decree there must be an antagonist in a position of authority who refuses to believe. The best thing about him is that he sarcastically refers to Wake with the names of other writers, always a different one. A running joke that gets funnier and funnier the more it happens. Like, "Thanks a lot, Bret Easton Ellis," is just such a hilarious thing for a meathead like him to say, as if he is familiar with a broad range of art and just thinks it's all trash. In Episode 6, though, Alan faces his deficiencies and his fate head on. No running away, no looking back. To get back to Diver's Isle, he has to pass through a maelstrom of energy, beat back the storm, and then rebuild the cabin from pure words, raw creativity. Here he can use the clicker to defeat Jaeger, as Tom foretold, or forewrote, and then write his ending, bringing departure to its dramatic conclusion. As he sinks into the depths of Cauldron Lake, Alice swims up, alive, saved. This is also more than Tom was able to do. If this is a spiral of causality, then this loop has gone much better. Even Deerfest ends up going off without a hitch, the light of day banishing the darkness and allowing Bright Falls to return to a semblance of normalcy. Minus, of course, the murders that have already occurred, but hey, rural Washington can be a little dangerous and strange sometimes. Alan, however, is consumed. He is trapped now in the dimension where the dark presence comes from, the dark place, a miasma of dreaming and nightmare. The final line is an all-timer. It's not a lake, it's an ocean. The ocean of the unconscious, where nothing is permanent, where there is no reality at all. Just Alan, trapped inside himself, trapped inside his failures and deficiencies, trapped completely in an ever-shifting hell of his own making. And if he's ever going to get out of it, he's going to have to roll up his sleeves and get to work. Alan Wake 1 has 2 pieces of connected DLC that form an epilogue which takes Alan from the cliffhanger ending you see in the main campaign to the story thread by which he will pull himself up into Alan Wake 2. They're kind of unmissable for a couple of reasons. The plot is one, but the aesthetics are really the more important reason. The Signal and the Writer, the 2 DLCs, become more and more surreal as they go along, corrupting the casual realism that the game had previously relied on to now depict Alan's mind and memories fragmenting into total madness and collapse. The DLCs begin where the trouble started, in the back hallway of the Oh Dear Diner. It's a murky, degraded version of the place, empty and oppressive. In the bathroom, Thomas Zane speaks to Alan through a crack in the bathroom mirror, giving Alan his iconic flashlight and pistol, explicitly making clear that these are not real weapons, these are just ideas, a method of clarifying his own path and purpose as part of himself falls apart at the seams. All throughout the DLCs are televisions where this manic, hateful version of himself screams at him, using prose to send waves of enemies against the part of Alan that you control. Something I really love about these DLCs is the extent to which the central premise of magical art and magical writing creating changes in reality becomes distorted by the nature of the dark place. In the real world of Alan Wake, the upper layer of reality, the prose had to be tight to do the work. The genre had to be consistent. The characterizations had to make sense on some level. It had to be a competent act of creation to work, something drafted, edited, complete. The prose that governs the world in the DLCs is, by contrast, completely improvisational, stream of consciousness, without any kind of consistency whatsoever besides the elements of despair and panic. When you find manuscript pages in these chapters, they simply fragment into words that can be used, words for weapons or ammunition, things that are useful, and also sometimes for enemies and things that are harmful. The Signal particularly has some great sequences involving manuscript pages fragmenting. The first being a journey through some woods that are filled with ghostly enemies who phase into existence out of nowhere and from every direction as you're going along. The words allow for environmental explosions to help a player thin the herds, because there's simply too many enemies to take down all on your own, otherwise. It is a relentlessly hostile encounter that far exceeds anything in the main game in terms of difficulty. In the main campaign, the Dark Presence was leaking through from the other realm, getting stronger, but its takeover was not complete. This is its home. Everything here is madness or death. In the other sequence, the Alan who is trying to kill you laments that all of his books are trash, just worthless pulp. Hundreds of copies of The Sudden Stop lay piled on the ground as trash. Then, these books attack. The flocks of crows from the main game have been replaced with swarms of books, and they hit for a lot more damage. The book swarms attack in a field of words which almost all spawn enemies. If you use anything like a flare or a flashbang, you're fucked. You have to be extremely careful to keep your aim high so you don't even accidentally leave the flashlight on one of the words for too long and make your own task harder. All the while, Alan is attacked by his own work, or perhaps his sense of that work's inadequacy and cheapness, self-pity and self-hatred, sharpened into an edge that cuts. The meaner Alan is to himself, the more spiteful towards the player the combat difficulty becomes. It's also kind of critical because it expands a player's understanding of Alice and her relationship with Alan. At the end of The Signal, there's a memory of her trying to get some good photographs of him for the dust jacket of The Sudden Stop. In so many of the flashbacks with Alice, and in so many of the present tense cutscenes from earlier, it's been hard to get a read on Alice. Why does she like him? Or more to the point, why does she put up with him? In the memory, Alice flexes her skills as a photographer, and in doing so puts the connection into better relief. She is an artist as well. She is capable of her own acts of creation. She is capable of rewriting reality in her own way through art. And she sees, in Alan, something worth illuminating. He is a subject that interests her. Even when he is disappointing her, she loves who he can be. Later, in The Writer, there is a sequence that bookends this in a despairing way. Alan is hallucinating a conversation between Dr. Hartman and himself, where he believes everything Hartman is saying, because there is, after all, a shade of truth in all of it. It is both emotionally and supernaturally true at this point that he is having a psychotic break. He is drowning in delusion. It would be easier if he could just accept that he was a bad person who has made bad choices, lie down, and have it all go away. But like any encounter with bad depression, it has to be fought through. Bullets are just an unusual medium through which to do the fighting. In this sequence, an interview with Alice also plays, like the one from the artist's retreat. This isn't Alice for real, though. This is the nightmare version of what Alan imagines that she must think of him. And, like with what Hartman is saying, it's not wholly wrong. This is character development for Alan. If he is saying this to himself, even in Alice's voice, then he acknowledges the harm he did. He understands how he was selfish. He is ready to change. These DLC operate on a fascinating variation of the dream logic that powered the main campaign. There, the dark presence was an external threat. Something used the darkness within Alan to manipulate him into telling a story that would unleash that darkness on the world. Here, all of that hostility is turned inwards. The journey is to try and arrive at a place where the creative impulse stops being destructive, where he can turn outward again, where he can make art and not just hate himself with every word. It is, I think, the most relatable Alan has been so far within the game. Before, I just wanted him to stop being such an asshole. Now, I am rooting for him to heal. As the signal transitions into The Writer, the level design becomes increasingly untethered from reality, venturing into total dreamscapes, fragments suspended in a void. The story also moves into its final loop at this stage. It is true that the diner is where the problems began for Alan, but it is not where the story began. The story began in a dream. It began with a lighthouse that Alan sensed was the last safe place in the entire world. What fascinates me about this is that although the main narrative here is about Alan, it is also reinforcing the idea that Thomas Zane engineered this entire chain of events, even when Tom is explicitly denying it. Tom has been trapped in the dark place for decades, in the ocean below Cauldron Lake. But what is a lighthouse if not the most powerful possible symbol that the ocean is not infinite, that not only does it have a shore, but that the shore is finally within sight? Tom and the lighthouse are the very first things Alan encounters within the game world, within this universe, and what Tom and the manuscript are spending the entire narrative guiding Alan back to. Departure was not enough to bring Tom back from the dark place, but it was just the story to put Alan in there with him, with all his powers beyond those of Tom himself. But those powers are useless if all Alan writes is self-loathing nonsense. Tom can't let Alan fail. So here he is again, like in the dream from the beginning, showing Alan the way up. For Alan, this conflict is like a hamster wheel, an incredible amount of effort just to end up where he started, further down the loop, or the spiral. Which actually happens within the level design. There is a literal hamster wheel referencing the events of the game, going round and round, which Alan has to traverse as an obstacle course. In a fun bit of dream logic, this ends at an elevator which goes up and opens at Stucky's gas station, where the Taken have an army waiting to stop him. In Alan Wake 2, the Dark Place uses this kind of spatial illogic all the time, using the dreamscape in a hostile way to disorient and confuse. This is a player's first taste of that magic. Another purpose of the DLCs within the larger multi-game narrative is to further set up and foreshadow Mr. Scratch. At the climax of the main game, Scratch is introduced as almost a casual, incidental element. Tom says not to worry about him. Your friends will meet him when you are gone. In The Writer, during a very cool sequence where you're fighting Taken on a dilapidated bridge, which you can deconstruct further to take some of them out, Alan asks if Scratch is the version of himself that's doing all this stuff to try and destroy him. Tom says, no, Scratch is something different. This is all Alan. Alan then asks Tom, straight up, if he is a fictional creation, which Tom denies, but he denies it in a way where he refuses to clarify how it would actually work instead. Tom dodges and obfuscates, rather than meeting the question with a straight answer. And with the benefit of hindsight, he was also lying about Scratch. Scratch is something different, yes, but he is Alan as well. Just all the worst parts exaggerated and intensified. If Alan did not have Scratch within him this whole time, then he would have just accepted Alice's gift of the typewriter and written something other than departure. Here, in a hidden area, the typewriter mocks him, the creative process hijacking the mind and destroying the life of the creator. Scratch may not be exactly the part of Alan that's opposing Alan in these DLCs, but that's only because Scratch is the part of Alan who is largely incapable of shame or retrospection. The enemy in these special episodes is the part of Alan that is hyperfixated on those things, lost in regret, darkness, adrift in the ocean, if not for the lone lighthouse towering on the horizon. Unlike The Signal, the writer does not really have a boss fight, just a final climactic push to the lighthouse where a player can let that light do the combat for them, erasing enemies once you've redacted the rocks standing in its way from the dreamscape. Climbing the steps to the top of the lighthouse seems like it's leading to some new revelation. But it isn't. It's leading back to Diver's Isle, back to the writer's room on the second floor with those two eye-like windows. Functionally, Alan never left. This has all been in his mind, in the dark place. The two Alans that reunite is actually just the one Alan letting go of his self-loathing and taking a deep breath. And then getting to work. The work that Tom wanted him to do all along. A brand new book with a brand new title, Return. Which is exactly where Alan Wake 2 picks up. Not Alan himself, though. Return is a more complicated book with a more complicated process, resulting in a more complicated game when playing through the sequel. It doesn't quite make sense that he would be able to pull off that magic right out the gate, so soon after breaking down completely. He needs time to hone his craft, and no writer really ever gets it completely right on the first draft. In one of the manuscript pages from Alan Wake 1, Alan talks about his work on the TV show Night Springs, saying, quote, "Even after all this time, hearing the Night Springs theme caused a surge of conflicting emotions in me. It had been my first real writing gig. Barry had known a guy who knew a guy, and suddenly I'd been a semi-regular writer on the show. I'd always been ashamed of the job, felt it was trash. I had wanted to be an artist, a novelist. I'd been naive back then. It had taken a long time to learn how to be proud of the work." End quote. Alan Wake's American Nightmare is an extremely short, extremely tangential game that takes place entirely within a Night Springs episode, being rewritten by Alan from deep inside the dark place. This episode, the Champion of Light versus the Herald of Darkness. Alan is the champion, Scratch is the herald. It is Alan's first serious attempt to escape the dark place after putting his mind back together in the DLC episodes. He's in a weak, vulnerable position as an artist. So I suppose it makes sense that he would, artistically, regress a little. American Nightmare is a hard game to actually recommend. I may have come around to appreciating the first game a lot more after coming to understand where it was going in the sequel, but American Nightmare is still baffling to me in most of its creative choices. I wrote back in 2017 that I didn't know if it was pulling my leg or having a seizure, and I still can't figure it out. It is, obviously, satirical. The tone is comedic, the action has been accelerated to the point where there is no longer even any tension there at all. It is neither horror nor thriller. It is an absurdist comedy about a writer revisiting his amateur writing in the most hacky, amateurish ways possible. It would be one thing to be able to say that it's deconstructing all its many cliches, but that isn't quite what's going on. There is not enough of an edge to deconstruct anything. There is nothing subtly clever going on to subvert them. It's just Alan being exactly the incompetent hack he was so worried that he was when his dreams insult him. I suppose if there is anything higher level going on with the satire, that this is like some sort of attempt to weaponize his fears of inadequacy against the dark place, to throw the stupidest shit imaginable down on the page and watch the dark place squirm as it is obligated to fashion reality around the absurdisms. It's just that now I, the player, am caught up in that shit too. The setting's even wildly different. We're in Arizona now. No trees, no fog, none of the beautifully crafted Pacific Northwest that was so critical to the mood of the main titles. In the real world, Barry is on tour with the Old Gods of Asgard as their band manager. In a hotel room, he falls asleep to an episode of Night Springs. Through this creative connection, Alan is able to reach out, or at least try to. But he's certainly not trying very hard, is he? Like, in the very first level, there are all these taken pouring out of an old oil derrick, using the black ooze of oil to slip in from the dark place. To destroy it, you must engineer a passage from the new manuscript. You need to match the scene to the page. You need a battery to power some flashing work lights. You need a valve crank to open the oil flow more. And then you need to play the song Clubfoot by Kasabian on compact disc. And if you do all these things, a satellite will bump into an asteroid, come crashing down to Earth, and will strike the oil well on its way to crashing beside the motel. Like, what? I knew this series of events was coming this time, and they still make no sense. It does not make dramatic sense. It does not make artistic sense. It was literally a plot point in the last game that the story had to fit with the genre somehow for the magic to work. What genre is this supposed to be? Even as a Twilight Zone parody, it would have to follow some of the Twilight Zone conventions and structures, which would mean weird details added up to some kind of ironic twist. There is no twist. There's no moral, unless Clubfoot is still kind of a jam counts as a moral. Parody could absolutely be the genre the magic is working within, but the absurdism is pushing against it, making the story weaker, not stronger. I guess American Nightmare being bad magic is part of why it doesn't work for Alan in the end. It's just also part of why it doesn't work for me either. And on that meta-narrative note, I guess there is one twist. Despite everything it has going against it, American Nightmare establishes a number of magical rules and themes that Alan Wake 2 still does adapt and follow up on much more competently. The main thing is that American Nightmare is explicitly a time loop, one that the Dark Presence is using against Alan. Alan must go through the loop 3 times in order to get out of it, which is something that happens to Saga Anderson in the next game every time she opens up an overlap to the Dark Place where her boss fights take place. In Alan Wake 2, when Alan does escape the Dark Place and winds up back in Bright Falls, he is wearing his outfit from American Nightmare. This is perhaps not the most canon story in the series, but it is clearly part of the intended progression. When Alan begins each loop, he begins at the wreckage of the Diver's Isle cabin, washed up from the ocean of the Dark Place on these Arizona shores. It establishes very clearly and immediately the unreality of it, that the player should not expect anything true to happen. But the game's narrative still explores 2 important relationship dynamics for Alan, that between Alan and Scratch, and that between Alan and Alice. Alan Wake 2 assumes a player has a basic familiarity with Scratch, and that familiarity can really only be built here within American Nightmare. Scratch isn't present much at all during the first game, or the Alan Wake expansion for Control. In this game, though, he's everywhere. The shittiest thing about the game is that although the time loop idea is kind of interesting, it means you will have to play through the 3 levels 3 times with minor variations. It's frustrating, it's cheap, but it isn't a mainline title, so it doesn't necessarily have to do better than that. In the last level of each loop, the drive-in, Scratch shows up to taunt you in person, directing Taken to ambush you in more and more dangerous groupings. Every go-around is a little harder than before, really ramping up for the last loop. But even if he's only ever at the drive-in as an antagonist, Scratch is within all 9 levels as a taunting presence on the television. He's a preening, unhinged serial killer. Many of the videos are him vamping around before murdering folks, kind of like Mark Duplass in the Creep movies and show. The videos really vary in quality. Some are actually good little horror shorts, others are flatly annoying. The interesting question to ask is where Scratch actually diverges from Alan. I mean, the murdering, sure, but also, for what it's worth, Alan spends almost all of every game killing folks with a gun. Folks taken by darkness, yes, but there is a reason he hesitated to tell that to the sheriff before she had a chance to see it for herself in the first game. There is a violence to Alan. Even without Scratch, he got into fights he didn't have to get into. He was a mean drunk. Scratch is absurdly, swaggeringly egotistical, but that was also always part of Alan. Consider what Scratch threatens with Alice. He says that he's going to come home to her, pretend to be the perfect husband, make her feel comfortable, until one day she'll run her mouth too much for his tastes, and then the knives will come out. For Scratch, actual knives. For Alan, is this not exactly what happened when she tried to help him in the first game? He knew that she was afraid of the dark, so he stormed out into the dark knowing that she would be uncomfortable and miserable and alone. He didn't know a witch would drag her down into a supernatural pit and hold her hostage. That was a bit of a curveball, but the fact still stands that over and over, he held Alice's trust until the moment it was inconvenient and then broke and abused the trust in selfish, childish ways. Scratch says that he is the version of Alan that Alan is too afraid to be. And this is true. As part of his character development, Alan begins to abhor these parts of himself, these impulses. But rather than just admit it, the magic of the dark place has externalized him into an alter ego, a separate entity, who will meet his friends when he is gone. He says he's been to visit Alice, which is sort of true and sort of a lie. In Alan Wake 2, it's revealed that Alice has been haunted by Scratch, that he keeps trying to harass her, that she has used her photography to capture his image and keep him at bay. American Nightmare is when that starts happening. In the AWE DLC for Control, which we'll talk about next, she even talks about it when interviewed by the authorities, who dutifully jot it down in their notes. Trying to get to Alice and save Alice is kind of the heart of Alan's motivation in American Nightmare. Most of these locations are memories from a vacation he once took with her. Even his outfit is the same one he wore when they were together in happier times. To defeat Scratch, he must play a film at the drive-in which he attributes to Alice, footage of these happier times edited together. Alice didn't make this film. Alan did with his manuscript, but it is representative of how he thinks of her, how he misses her. Though not all of his loneliness comes out in an especially healthy way. All three of the levels feature a damsel in distress character who Alan can explain things to and get to be the big, strong protector guy. In the first one, it's Emma, a car mechanic who is friendly, but also clearly a little chilly. She is happy to help Alan, having already helped Scratch accidentally because she thought he was handsome and intriguing, before she realized he was also psychotic. The way Alan treats her is slightly condescending. He's the smart, rugged champion of light, and she's just an aw-shuck small-town girl from down Arizona way. In the first two circuits of the time loop, she dies. Alan leaves her alone, thinking he's done enough to keep her safe, when he hasn't. On the third loop, he actually succeeds in helping her, which is probably a good thing because in the third loop, she starts smoking a lot of pot about it. In the second level, the observatory, there's a scientist lady who is wearing a cocktail dress under her lab coat. She just came from a gallery opening, you see. She doesn't fawn over Alan and actually offers pushback against the idea that she is fictional, finding it somewhat offensive that Alan controls fate in such an all-encompassing way. It's bullshit. She should control her own destiny, not this writer who can't even conjure up a sweater for her. The third level is the most ridiculous one. The drive-in theater is run by a friend of Alice's who was seduced by Scratch and is filled with an intense sexual desire for either Scratch or Alan, whoever happens to be nearby and handsy. Alan stoically resists her come-ons, which lets him be more of a champion of light. When he restores power to the drive-in, he can turn on the lights and bring her back to normal. Alan Wake, as we know, is a writer's version of a writer, embodying all the Stephen King-esque tropes that burden carries with it. One of those burdens is often that guys like this cannot, for the life of them, write women. Women become props or avenues of wish fulfillment or consider their own bodies exclusively from the perspective of the men looking at them, all three cliches of which are present here in American Nightmare. Stephen King can write women, but even he falls into these traps from time to time. His son, Joe Hill, is actually way better at it, and at writing endings for that matter. Both of their writing styles are similar, though Joe is less of a prolific author than King, but I think part of that is that he's a more careful artist with a stronger craft. In his book, The Fireman, which is kind of his version of The Stand, but, better, the main antagonist is a bad writer. His wife discovers his manuscript and describes it like this, quote, "She read 30 pages. She had to quit there. She couldn't go any further and still be in love with him. In truth, maybe 30 pages had been 3 too many. There was all this, his derisive rage and self-pity, and there was bad writing, too. His paragraphs never ended, neither did his sentences. Sometimes it would take him 30 words before he found his way to a verb. He had never told her what the book was about, not in any concrete terms, although sometimes he would say something airy-fairy like, it's about the terror of an ordinary life, or it's the story of a man shipwrecked in his own mind. It was bad enough that she had been so utterly convinced that he had a brilliant mind, but much worse to discover he had been convinced of it too, and on such thin evidence." End quote. It's hard not to see shades of Alan Wake in there. Not Alan at his best, but certainly as Mr. Scratch. The thing is, though, that with something like The Fireman, what you've got is good writing about a bad writer. With American Nightmare, you have bad writing by a bad writer, or at the very least, a writer who is wildly underperforming and getting lost in the weeds of his own juvenilia. Sam Lake is actually, of course, an amazing writer. This is bad on purpose, but doing it on purpose doesn't make it enjoyable. The dialogue is just absolutely interminable and awkward, much more often than it feels satirically entertaining. In one of the manuscript pages here in American Nightmare, Wake talks about his work on Night Springs. Quote, "It wasn't the great American novel of my fantasies, but it taught me discipline and craft, and the difference between wanting to be a writer and actually writing." End quote. Which, God knows, is an important distinction to learn and a hurdle that not everyone can make it across. If we're talking about trash, I admit that I am a fan of American Horror Story. One of the seasons is a Stephen King parody itself, the first half of the double feature season where it talks about vampires in Maine who use a drug that can inspire artists at the cost of their humanity. Before taking the drug, the protagonist appeals to his editor about his deadline, saying, quote, "I just haven't really been feeling it, you know?" To which his editor replies, "That's cute, but you're a professional author and you feel it when the work bell dings." Figuring out how to feel it when the work bell dings is the heart of the struggle of trying to do all this shit for real. Sometimes the first draft isn't going to be pretty, sometimes you just gotta get words on paper. If you're lucky, it works. If you're unlucky, well, you get to have your very own American Nightmare. What the game is really built for, more than anything, is simply to be a game. The majority of levels available aren't these 3 core levels around which the campaign revolves. They're arcade levels where you need to survive until morning against hordes of the Taken. The game is a chance to explore and intensify the combat rhythms of Alan Wake 1, to push them in a decontextualized mechanical setting to their furthest possible limits. When Alan Wake picks up a submachine gun and says, "Good to finally go full auto," this does not indicate an experience with a lot of tension. It indicates an experience where you're going to roll up your sleeves and get weird with it. It is a chance to experiment with all sorts of weapons, different types of shotguns, assault rifles, crossbows, nail guns, plus all the classics like the hunting rifle and revolver, in a setting that's action first and pretty much action only. In an interview with Complex, developer Oskari Hakkanen said, quote, "Believe it or not, we do look at the feedback that our fans give us through our Facebook pages and emails and so forth. One of the things that came up with Alan Wake was that people wanted to see a bit more escalation in the threat and the enemies, and perhaps in the types of weapons as well. The core combat mechanic was great, but they wanted to see more escalation. So we started looking at it like, well, what could we do? Alan Wake is a franchise that's very close to our hearts, so we just took it all the way to the extreme and kind of made these white-boxed arcade action maps where we threw in lots of crazy weapons and lots of crazy enemies. And in the office, the developers, all of us were playing against each other. I'm coming in the morning, ramping up a high score, and just going to the whiteboard to write up my high score. Matthias comes in for his lunch and goes, "Fuck, Oz has got that, so he'll have to get a better one, wipe it off the board and put his high score up." And that's how it got started, really, not really with the intention to start doing arcade action, but to kind of test how far we could take the action. Now, as it stands, we realize just from the whiteboard how our developers, who are gamers, love it. We're like, this is a great fit for Xbox Live Arcade, end quote. It's not the only time that Remedy has made a bet on multiplayer, action-oriented takes on its story-driven titles. Recently, FBC Firebreak has been in the news a bit for its failure to make a decent profit return, with players not really connecting with its live service elements and not really getting what they wanted out of the control setting from it. American Nightmare is an interesting kind of prototype for that kind of mechanically focused spin-off, and a compelling example of how it can fall flat or fall short. In a certain way, it also made making a full sequel with the mechanical style of the first game a lot harder. Where would it escalate from here? How could it and still remain a horror title? Alan Wake 2 retains the flashlight darkness dynamic, but shifts everything around it. It will never be fast like this again. Well, perhaps not never. I said I didn't think there would be an Alan Wake after American Nightmare, and I was hugely wrong about that, which I'm glad of. But I learned my lesson. Not to try and anticipate what Remedy will or won't do, because their one greatest consistency as a developer is that they always manage to surprise. Remedy's next big project couldn't be more tonally different from Alan Wake if it tried. A sci-fi action game about time machines and corporate greed. Released in 2016, Quantum Break was an important precursor to Alan Wake 2 in a few key ways, the most important of which is its creative focus on blending live-action media with the 3D rendered storytelling. Quantum Break, in between each of its 5 acts, had an actual TV show which would change based on your actions during the game. Alan Wake 2 blends the live action much more freely and creatively than Quantum Break did, but Quantum Break is the game where they really developed their modern style as a game studio, the first one to take the live action flourishes present in the earlier Remedy titles and make them a central pillar of its storytelling and aesthetic. It's important enough that its characters even significantly overlap into Alan Wake 2. Remedy would not hang on to all the creative rights for Quantum Break, so like Max Payne becoming Alex Casey, there was some renaming involved. Villain Martin Hatch became Warlin Door. Protagonist Jack Joyce became Tim Breaker, who in the very opening narration of Quantum Break says he broke time, so that fits. Really, the entire Time Breaker DLC is about continuing themes and story elements from Quantum Break, and it's by far the best of the Night Springs DLCs, so having at least some familiarity with this part of the Remedy canon helps. But it's not necessary. I played Alan Wake 2 without having played Quantum Break first, and I was never lost. I just didn't quite get some of the details and creative overlaps. Quantum Break is full of little references to Alan Wake as well, in ways large and small. In the very first level, there is a whole trailer for a film version of Alan Wake's return. It doesn't completely resemble the Alan Wake 2 we eventually got, but it has details that are extremely similar, like the two FBI agents, one of which is Alex Casey, drinking coffee in unison. It's actually pretty wild how much the tone matches what would come later, how prophetic it feels, even if it was a prototype idea that was refined later on. The most prophetic thing is by far this chalkboard in a classroom in the second level. It's got everything. I mean everything. It has the whole story so far of Alan Wake 1 figured out and explicitly arranged. It is closer than the games have ever come to laying out lore within a codex. And it's just a missable detail on the wall of Quantum Break. It even correctly foreshadows Alan Wake 2 by establishing that before return, Alan Wake will need another connecting book, Initiation, to work the magic properly. So, years before Alan Wake 2, observant fans knew the general outline of what was to come. There are smaller details too, of course, like there's a copy of The Sudden Stop signed by the author suggesting that there is at least some version of Alan Wake alive and well within the world, perhaps one who never went to the dark place and just kept working. That's not really clear. Quantum Break is not a primary world in the Remedy-connected universe. In fact, it was made before Remedy had really settled on the idea of there being one. The references were just for fun at the time, but they have taken on greater significance as all the games in the Remedy canon have been bound together in more explicit and creative ways in the years since. One of my favorite media theories of all time is the Snow Globe Kid connected universe, an unintentional conspiracy theory that has hilariously enormous consequences. In the 1988 TV drama St. Elsewhere's series finale, the final scene suggests that the entire show and all its characters were daydreamed by a child named Tommy Westfall. But the trick of it is, St. Elsewhere had a lot of cameos, like Detective John Munch, who was first on a show called Homicide, but then later on Law & Order and its many spin-offs. They visited Cheers, the Boston bar from the sitcom of the same name. Suppose, then, that these are all also taking place in Tommy Westfall's imagination within his little snow globe. According to the Tommy Westfall Connected Universe fan wiki, there are over 1,500 movies and shows that can be connected in some way to St. Elsewhere, or a character who interacted with a character, or some other chain of detail. It's kind of like 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where you can typically tie most any creative work or actor back to Kevin Bacon in 6 steps of connection or less. This was obviously never deliberate with Tommy Westfall and all that, but it is relentlessly amusing to me how well it all tracks, that some of the most memorable characters, well-known settings, and strongest dramas of television history are all just dreams from some kid with a snow globe and a lot of free time on his hands. What's even funnier is that the Remedy-connected universe actually does function in almost exactly this way, and in a way that is deliberate, that is explicit. Rather than Tommy Westfall's snow globe, we have Alan Wake's typewriter as the source of all these many worlds and stories, in genres that seem, at first, completely unrelated to each other. Thousands of people and hundreds of stories that are fiction within fiction, dreams that don't know their dreams, a dreamer whose reach is endless. In 2019, Remedy skewed back toward some of the themes and aesthetics of horror with a brand new supernatural thriller, Control. While Quantum Break has just a few scattered references to Alan Wake, Control is deeply tied to the Alan Wake universe and characters, culminating in an entire DLC which serves as a kind of prequel and bridge between the game and Alan Wake 2. Similarly, Alan Wake 2 has a DLC which crosses over with Control significantly. The overlap between the two is more explicit and important than the way Max Payne and Quantum Break are tied into the broader universe, possibly having to do with how both those properties are owned by other companies now. It's intellectual property law and not just creative license. Control is, I think, Remedy's best. Alan Wake 2 is a superior horror game and probably a better script, but the gameplay and level design of Control is vastly superior to the tight repeating levels of Alan Wake 2. The protagonist, Jesse Faden, is a real delight, upbeat and wry, curious and strong. Control takes place in a building called the Oldest House, a constantly shifting mix of mid-century brutalism and otherworldly surrealism. It is occupied by the Federal Bureau of Control, a government agency that's basically what would happen if the X-Files had an entire department with a FEMA-sized budget. They investigate paranormal events, people, and ephemera, keeping and cataloging some of what they can, eliminating those threats that cannot be contained. Control does not take place in a separate universe from Alan Wake, it is precisely the same one. It just expands the scope far beyond Bright Falls and the Dark Place. In it, the FBC and the Oldest House are invaded by an extra-dimensional force called the Hiss. It is a kind of oily resonance that creeps into people and takes them over, not unlike the Dark Presence. Just more sci-fi than horror. For the most part, Jesse has bigger fish to fry than a writer who went missing years ago, but even within the main campaign, his presence can be felt. There is a vision of Wake triggered by a manuscript page of his that they've retained. There is that document referencing Alice being interviewed. There have been investigations into Bright Falls going back years, back to the first incidents with Zane and the Old Gods of Asgard. The connections made backwards with the Alan Wake games already released are important, but not quite as important as the new elements Control introduces going forward, the most important of which is, oddly, the janitor. Ahti is the first character that Jesse meets. Like the Anderson brothers, he is a god, a Finnish god of the sea. Supernatural ocean being his domain, you can see where he might become relevant to folks like Tom and Alan. Ahti is hilarious and charming. He speaks in bizarre aphorisms that are hard to interpret. Some are cryptic, some are just nonsense. So, really, a lot like the Anderson brothers, but more sober. Who do sort of, also make an appearance. It is written into Control that the Oldest House is some kind of manifestation of the World Tree. Down at its roots, Ahti is taking some sort of vacation. He gives you a Walkman, which will play a song by Old Gods of Asgard, technically Poets of the Fall, that allows you to access the Ashtray Maze, one of the best action sequences in the game. What's wild is that there are apparently hidden lyrics in a song Old Gods of Asgard did for American Nightmare that reference Control, saying supernatural events will happen again in the town of Ordinary, which is where Jessie is from, where her own backstory began. Control reaches its own climax, largely separate from anything Alan Wake related, which is for the best. Control is its own story, its own mood, its own visual language. At the beginning of the game, Jessie becomes director of the FBC by essentially drawing the sword from the stone, picking up an Excalibur-like device called the service weapon. By the end of the game, she has earned her title. But the Hiss are not eradicated from the building, the place is still in lockdown, and there is still much more to do. The DLCs for Control both take place here, in the post-game. One is Foundation, which I'll touch on briefly a little later as it relates to the World Tree concept. The second takes Jessie into the sealed Investigations wing of the building, where something familiar and foul lies in wait. Control has moments where it is quite creepy and unnerving, but it is not a horror game. There's too much wonder and curiosity for that, too much whimsy, and too much empowerment besides. Jessie, especially at the endgame where all her powers are beefed up, is just fucking unstoppable, pulling chunks of concrete out of the walls and dumpsters up off the ground to fling at opponents and spitting bullets and rockets and all sorts of fire out of her service weapon. There are sometimes shielded enemies within Control, but these shields can be broken down with brute force, not light. Where the combat of Alan Wake 2 is slowed down from Alan Wake 1, Control's is much faster than both. It's snappy and does not incorporate much of any sense of tension at all. The Alan Wake expansion would not really be much of a crossover, however, if it did not somehow shift the genre at least somewhat into horror. How does that work if none of the game mechanics and none of the characters are really designed to support the genre shift? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. You let the darkness in. Control does not change its core combat loop to accommodate the Alan Wake vibe, it changes its environment. It isolates Jessie from her support network, and makes one addition, a nearly unstoppable monster made from the remains of what was once Dr. Emil Hartman. Because Control has no flashlight mechanic, it is unreasonable to put a darkness shield on basic enemies, but putting darkness barriers on environmental features is a little different. A player can use their telekinetic power to hold work lamps and kind of mimic the mechanic in a way that would be too awkward for combat, but works just fine in a more casual way. There are a number of side quests from Ahti that invite players to do this wherever they can, and also to find wilted and neglected houseplants and use the light to bring them back to life. If you do all of Audie's quests, he even sends you a postcard from where he's taking his next vacation, Watery, Washington. Watery isn't an accessible location in the original Alan Wake games, but it is on the map, along with posters for Coffee World. It's about as explicit as you get for a "see you in Alan Wake 2" kind of send-off. The only disappointment is that Hartman does not really retain any kind of personality as a monster in the expansion. One of the charming things about the Taken has always been how they menacingly growl statements and conversational snippets that are extremely mundane and everyday, like the benefits of Nordic walking, like the person is still trapped in there and unaware of how violent they have become. Hartman's mind and self have been obliterated. First, he was taken by the darkness, as seen during the events of Alan Wake 1. He was then contained here in the investigations wing. And then when the Hiss invaded, this new supernatural affliction battled it out with the darkness, twisting him, mutating him into this third thing. The Alan Wake expansion is divided into 3 sections of the investigations wing, one centered around a lunar lander that has brought back some sort of non-human entity, one around a train car that keeps reliving its own tragic crash, and one centered around good old Bright Falls, Washington. In each wing, Hartman must be driven back by turning on the lights. Illuminating his twisted form is genuinely a very creepy experience. Some of the Hiss-corrupted enemies are twisted and strange, but a shimmer covers the worst of the corruption. Body horror is not really the focus of Control. Nor was it the focus of Alan Wake's horror for the most part previously. So I suppose Hartman really is a third thing in more ways than one. In the final fight, the way it works really is exactly like Alan Wake. You turn on the lights until the Taken can no longer hide from the light, then you open fire until the thing is dead. It's a really fun, effective merger of the game's 2 combat rhythms, the 2 combat loops. And it's hardly the only way the 2 properties blend concepts. Control and Alan Wake interact with each other in terms of language, which is especially relevant to a story whose fate is in the hands of a writer. One concept is objects of power, everyday items imbued with a kind of supernatural vitality. Like, your telekinetic strikes in Control are powered by a floppy disk that used to contain nuclear launch codes. It has retained the impulse to destructively launch whatever is at hand. Wake's clicker is an obvious object of power, his manuscript pages too. The other is the concept of a threshold, where one universe bleeds into another. Alan Wake 2 refers to it as an overlap instead, though perhaps there is a bit of a distinction. In Control, a threshold is where 2 dimensions or universes are joined and bleed together, but in Alan Wake 2, an overlap is where a location in the dark place and a location in the real world stack on top of each other and become blended that way. These are extremely similar concepts, but if Alan is choosing to write one word and not the other, that speaks to an intention of them being separate concepts. It is unlikely that Jesse and the Federal Bureau of Control are part of Wake's fiction, that Wake invented them, but the concepts of Control do influence his prose, and so does the magic of Alan's prose influence the world of Control. Alan writes within the DLC that he had been desperately searching for a connection back from the dark place, and that Alice is that connection, just like she was in American Nightmare. When the FBC interviewed Alice and brought her to the oldest house, that's when all the trouble started. Trouble followed in her, well, wake. Rather than create the FBC, Alan is adapting it to suit his purposes, just like Tom wants. The DLC opens with a conversation between Tom and Alan, and this time there is no diving suit. They look identical. He proposes an artistic collaboration, the results of which we see in Alan Wake 2, the new text of Return. He also says that he will deal with Scratch, which is kind of a lie. He will deploy Scratch against Alan for the purposes of making sure Return goes the way that he wants it to go. And more. Tom says Alan is misunderstanding him, which is certainly true. While nothing is absolutely concrete at this point, Alan misunderstands Tom the way he misunderstands Scratch, as something separate and external, and not some kind of internal aspect run amok. While this is perhaps a bit of a stretch, it's worth noting that in Alan Wake 1, in the very beginning in the Oh Dear Diner during Episode 1, the Anderson brothers refer to Alan as Tom. Then in Alan Wake 2, Audie the janitor also refers to Alan as Tom. These things are not coincidence, these details are deliberate. They are written into reality by Sam Lake, with just as strong a magic as Alan's. Alan himself even kind of touches on that part of the process within this very DLC, writing about how to escape He has to change his tone, change his style, go through innumerable forgotten revisions to find the most powerful kind of ritual magic. He has settled on the trail of breadcrumbs method. Of the audience, he writes, quote, "They are drawn to the mystery, obsessed. You set it up, they put it together. Their interpretation. And there's only one because you give them no choice. And they believe it because it's theirs now." End quote. Well, shit. Alan really got my ass with that one. A lot of what I talk about in regards to what's really been going on is my interpretation based on what's presented to me, but based on what's presented to me, there really is only one conclusion I'm being directed towards. The magic has compelled me to reach that conclusion, but because I am the one that put it together, I do feel involved. I do feel included. I am touched by the magic as surely as Sheriff Breaker or Barry or Jesse Faden. What's remarkable about Alan Wake as a series is how effective it is in its meta-commentary, how truly robust it is as fiction about fiction. It could be so slight, or cheap, or easy, but instead it builds upon its foundations with brick after brick of incisive detail. Even in something that should theoretically be very tangential, like a post-game DLC for a completely different title with a completely different tone and focus, Alan Wake can so easily create its own overlap with it, layering its creative methods and priorities in, sneaking in its own story beats. For the magic to work, it has to fit the genre. It has to be consistent. It needs to be good. What a fucking impressive thing it is that the game can really pull that off. Within Control is something called the Ocean View Motel, a nowhere place between dimensions, where Jesse goes to travel between locations from time to time. The doors are marked with symbols representing different domains. Alan's is marked with a spiral. The doors are mostly shut, for now, but they will open eventually, when it's dramatically appropriate, when it's time. For this game, Jessie has her own doors to open. For Alan, there is a process to follow. Before stepping over the threshold, the door has to be unlocked. The drama has to be right. Return is an epic attempt to defy the very nature of the dark place, and a true epic needs a prologue, a key in the lock, before the knob can be turned and the miracle illuminated. I think it is fair to call Alan Wake 2 a miracle. In an era of corporate homogenization, a broad devaluing of the arts, stagnation in audience attention spans, and an aversion to complexity, it is an artistic work that fundamentally rejects every last one of those ideas with the bold and humanist assumption that if you make something beautiful, people will resonate with it no matter what. Plus, it's extremely fun, playful, and deeply frightening when it wants to be. Alan Wake 2 is flatly unlike any other game I've played in tone, pacing, and narrative. If you add in the DLCs, which are all wildly different from one another, the total experience becomes even more weird and wonderful. It's a game that has been carefully built up for more than a decade. It could not exist as it does without everything Remedy has done as a studio, but it is also somewhat unlike any of the other Remedy titles. It is not a large, sprawling game like Alan Wake 1 or Control. It is not a straightforward game like Quantum Break. It is not just a series of combat encounters punctuated by willful weirdness like the Max Payne's are. It's a little bit of many of those things, but in proportions that are completely different, completely unique, precision crafted to work for this setting, this story. It isn't just that Alan Wake spent 13 years revising and rewriting to come up with a story that was good enough to work as ritual magic. Sam Lake and Remedy spent 13 years honing their craft to an impossibly sharp edge. This is not the kind of game that a studio that lays off the majority of its developers every couple of years could accomplish. This is what long-term cumulative industry knowledge and craft looks like. It is a game that mixes so many different forms of media in such surprising ways that it can be extremely difficult to categorize and pin down as a work of art. Like how it differs in structure from Alan Wake 1. It's not organized around TV-style episodes the same way the first game was, but the way its pacing and level design operate, it is actually significantly closer to the experience of a television show than the first game was. The entire first section of Alan Wake 2 is an interactive police procedural framed with familiar story elements in oddly remixed forms. You begin as a doomed man rising up from the depths of Cauldron Lake. Naked, in the dark, the old man stumbles along until he is met by a cult of deer mask-wearing strangers who murder him and cut out his heart. This inciting event and prologue is then followed up on with the arrival of FBI agents Alex Casey and Saga Anderson, slightly different versions of the characters seen in the return video from Quantum Break. You meet with the local law enforcement who were side characters in Alan Wake 1 and make your way down to the murder site, at which point you investigate as Saga, the playable protagonist. This is closer to how L.A. Noire did it than anything in a Remedy game, hewing so faithfully to the mood, dialogue, and rhythm of police procedural drama. The details, though, are all horror. They are all Alan Wake, down to the roots. The dead man is Agent Nightingale, taken by the dark presence in the last game, now spat up again by the story to kick itself off once more. Alex Casey is made real, made manifest, an actual person and not just a noir cliché. He even mentions how he gets a lot of shit from fellow agents for sharing a name with Alan's creation. What begins as an investigation into a ritual murder soon reveals itself as the actual ritual. Trying to find their way down to the shore, Saga and Alex find their culprit, a manuscript page. About them reading the manuscript page. Alan Wake 2 expands the horror in an incredibly meaningful way. Alan Wake 1's villain was the Dark Presence, the horror of him being trapped inside his own creation, struggling against his own ideas and his own deficiencies. Saga is a different kind of protagonist. She is not one of Alan's creations. She is her own person, with her own life, her own story. But now that's being taken away from her by the manuscript of Return. As Alan says in the opening narration, "This is not the story I hoped it to be. This is not the ending I wanted. This story will eat us alive. The story is a monster, and monsters wear many faces." It would not be all that scary to have Alan as the main character again, to play the same conflict twice. A sequel has to evolve. The horror has to evolve. And much more frightening than being trapped by your own mediocrities is the possibility that we might become trapped by someone else's. Alan is not the hero of this story. He is the villain. For years, trapped in the dark place, he has worked on this story. It would not be a horror story if he was triumphant or successful in doing so. The story had to be sick. The story had to be consumptive. The story had to be a monster. And to fight that monster, he had to find a hero outside of himself, beyond his own imagination. Return cannot be defeated by changing the story. Departure wasn't even defeated that way, it just ended the way Thomas Zane hoped it would. Return can only be defeated by telling a different story entirely, robbing it of its power by the essential truth that not everything a creative work does is owned or understood by the author themselves. Portrayed by Melanie Limbird, Saga Anderson is more or less the perfect counter to Alan Wake in terms of character balance. Where Alan was egotistical, emotionally driven, and creative, Saga is empathetic, rational, and pragmatic. It's her pragmatic streak that lets her accept the irrationality of suddenly finding herself in a supernatural horror story. It is happening, so there's no point in arguing it. The thing to do is find the shortest path to why and how. Saga as a character, and as a performance, also has a kind of a basis in Stephen King, particularly the prestige TV adaptation of The Outsider, with the private investigator Holly Gibney played by Cynthia Erivo. King has talked about how Holly is one of the favorite characters he's ever done, and it's easy to see why. She's clever, funny, and intensely likable. Saga Anderson has all that same kind of energy going for her, although she is very much her own character. Saga's analytic power as an investigative agent is represented through her access to the mind place. This is a very old technique called the method of loci, where a person kind of tricks their memory into making stronger connections by visualizing them as environmental problems, and not just abstract ones. For Saga, this means having instantaneous access to an index card and string corkboard where her various cases and connections can be laid out. Every piece of evidence is collected as a Polaroid picture for her to pin on the board and sort out what goes with what and why. In a classic Alan Wake kind of twist, it is later revealed that the mind place is more of an actual place with its own supernatural qualities, but for the most part, it's a really fun application of a very old detective trope. No matter how outlandish things get within the narrative, Saga is able to organize it, contextualize it, and in doing so, leverage power over it. Breaking down a story to its components and then laying them out in a forensic way gives the audience power over the story, not the other way around. Saga is not a good candidate for being made a victim of this monster of a story. Not at first. The story has to figure her out. It has to probe around for her weakness. And it finds it in her daughter Logan. Saga begins the game happily married with a daughter she loves, far away in another town. But that won't do. As the magic of Return transforms Bright Falls and its environs, it corrupts her life. It rewrites her backstory. The first hint of trouble comes from Rose, the waitress from the last game. Like Cynthia Weaver was for Tom, she is an acolyte of Alan's, the most receptive to his fiction. So she recognizes Saga. She knows that Saga used to live over in the trailer park in Watery, where her daughter drowned, which led to divorce. A tragic backstory, a dramatic connection to Cauldron Lake and the Dark Place, a whole of pain and misery where her sense of fulfillment used to be. Now that's something that a monster of a story can use. That's making Saga into a victim, weakening her, creating a wound for the darkness to seep in. Slowly, the story's power grows, and so this new fiction replaces her biographical reality. She has friends that she doesn't remember, like the Koskela brothers who own the trailer park and Coffee World. Alex Casey comes to forget that Saga's daughter was ever alive, and treats Saga as if she is crazy for remembering differently. Eventually, after spending hours trying to get through to him on the phone, she calls her husband. He tells her never to call again, that she can't keep doing this to him, that their daughter is dead and they are through. The story struggled to hurt her directly, so it went after those she loved. All that Saga can do is cling to her memory of what reality ought to be and pursue the thing that is actually responsible for trying to kill her daughter. But is the fiction to blame, or is it the author? Alan Wake 2 is bisected into 2 sets of levels that can be played in any order except for the introduction and climax. Saga's levels followed the manuscript of Return, written by Scratch. Alan's levels followed the manuscript of Initiation, which he wrote trying to thwart his alter ego. The first time I played, I alternated between them, and then the second time I did each character's journey straight through, Alan and then Saga. Either way is totally valid, but I think in terms of personal preference, I lean towards doing Alan's chapters first. That is, after all, the trilogy order. The revelations from Initiation clear up some of the ambiguity of Return so that the events track better and make more immediate sense. The fundamental problem for Alan is that since he and Scratch are not really different people, just aspects of the same, neither can outwit or fully defeat the other. The opening line of narration for the whole game is back to the beginning, because these 2 manuscripts are a closed loop. Scratch tries to undo Alan's work on Initiation, Alan tries to undo Scratch's work on Return, they both ruin each other's endings and send themselves back to the very opening of the loop, with Saga and Bright Falls caught in the middle. Though the game treats them being one and the same as a twist, it is one that's widely telegraphed, and has been for a long time. Here, in the bathroom of the Oh Dear Diner in the Signal DLC for the first game, there is a graffiti, "John Miro was here." This is a small but important part of a complex interaction between several Remedy games. Alan Wake was not the first Remedy game to get incredibly metatextual. Max Payne 2 was. I had trouble getting on board with it the first time I played Max Payne 2. It was not what I expected or thought I wanted out of a Max Payne sequel, similar to how I didn't quite know how to interpret and accept what Alan Wake 1 was doing my first time around. My difficulty was in how Max Payne 2 is essentially about Max realizing that he is a fictional character, trapped within genre, doomed by his own story. There's even a level called A Linear Sequence of Scares, which is essentially lampooning the basic level design and gameplay experience of the game itself. New York City reduced to a funhouse carnival ride with darkness and violence based on a fictional TV show called Address Unknown. Address Unknown is about a man, John Mira, who fights through Noir York City in pursuit of his evil double, just like Alan does. Address Unknown culminates in John Mira having a phone conversation with the evil man, who is also John Mira, realizing that they are the same and that he is the killer, and then moving on to the next level. The dark place as depicted in Alan Wake 2 has become Noir York City. Alex Casey's journey through Alan Wake 2 is largely the same as Max Payne's character arc through Max Payne 2. They are both becoming increasingly aware of the fiction that binds them and traps them. In the beginning of Alan's story in this game, he gets his iconic revolver and flashlight from Casey, who dies in an alley, killed by Scratch. He reflects bitterly that he always dies in the alley, always the same way, every loop. Each major level in the Initiation set is its own loop, one Alan has to run through 3 times, like it was in American Nightmare, but with much more variance. Each is a draft of sorts. In a later draft, it is Alan who kills Casey, right there in that same alley. In the 3rd loop, Scratch's Cult of the Word draws Casey into a situation where he is confronted with his own fictional nature in a way that is impossible to deny, the dream then addressing Alan directly, asking if he has taken over the detective's role in pursuing the mystery. Alan's story has become John Mira's, or perhaps it always was. Alex Casey's story has become the most tragic extreme version of that of Max Payne 2. The metatextuality of the story becomes so densely layered that it becomes incredibly difficult to fully parse exactly what's going on, which is intentional. Explanations being antithetical to the poetry of fear and all that. And fear is still the goal, despite the abstractions. The fear of your life not being your own, your destiny not being your own, The fear of being part of some kind of insoluble puzzle or unwinnable game, far outside of any input or control you might have over it. This was the kind of fear on which the 1990 film Jacob's Ladder was based, where the main character spends the entire film realizing that he's experiencing a terrible hallucination, that he feels as if he is dying because he is, somewhere in the real world, far away. The surrealism and psychedelic misery of Jacob's Ladder is reflected strongly within the tone and imagery of Alan Wake 2. These are horror stories where the protagonist is drowning within the nightmares of their own imaginations, drowning in the ocean of the dark place. Noir York, John Mira. The creative overlap between Max Payne 2 and Alan Wake 2 is so wild and strange they sit on top of one another, echoes of the same themes, the same imagery, sometimes even the same characters. Just like the other overlaps that Saga Anderson and Alan Wake experience within the game itself. The overlaps climax each of the main chapters from Return with elements of the climax from corresponding chapter of Initiation. But they aren't arranged in a completely linear way. They are not where the stories overlap in time. They are where the stories overlap in intention. Consider the very first one, Saga's experience at Cauldron Lake overlapping with Alan's experience at Caldera Street Station. These do overlap in time, partly because they occupy the same structural space within the manuscripts. They are the beginning, the inciting events. The first overlap occurs before a player is allowed to switch freely between the stories because it needs to establish the ideas effectively first. Each world has mirror versions of a lot of things, like the cults. In the Dark Place version of New York, this is the cult of the Word. They work explicitly for Scratch, worshipping Alan's works, trying to make them manifest with violence and chaos. In Caldera Street Station, they have lured an FBI agent to his death to serve as a ritual sacrifice. There's two cults, actually, the Cult of the Word and the Torchbearers. In the first Alan Wake game, the Torchbearers worked against the manuscript and the Dark Presence, but here in the Dark Place, they are twisted, inverted. One of the most spooky moments in the game is venturing through a burnt-out subway car full of victims that the Torchbearers have lit on fire. The real victim, though, is Agent Nightingale. He is lying at the heart of the twisting tunnels, his own heart cut out already. When Alan reaches the body, he sees a vision of Saga, and then the heart disappears, pushed through into the real world just in time for the opening sequence. What's interesting is that the Cult of the Tree, who cut out Nightingale's heart on the other side, have a hidden motive. If you open up all the hidden supply caches, which is much easier to do than in the first game, you get a key to open up the lighthouse out by Watery and access hidden documents and manuscript pages which lay out the cult's motivation. They are an outgrowth of the first game's Torchbearers, working explicitly to stop the Dark Presence and stop the story from taking over. They are waiting for Nightingale because they know he is a Taken. They cut out his heart and then use Alan's clicker to try to destroy the darkness within him like Alan did to Barbara Yager in the first game's climax. It just doesn't work because the clicker doesn't quite follow that logic. It is an amplifier. It makes manifest creative works. And in the end of the first game, it was amplifying Alan's manuscript for Departure. The Cult of the Tree aren't using a creative work. They're just hoping for a supernatural result. They wear the deer masks to scare people out of the woods so that those people don't themselves become taken. In the morgue of the Bright Falls police station, Nightingale comes back from the dead, as a Taken, and when Saga shoots him, he disappears into the overlap where she will have to venture and defeat him properly. By putting Saga's part first and obscuring the motive of the Cult of the Tree, the mystery is preserved. It is much harder to figure out until you have more pieces of the puzzle. But once Alan's sequence is done, it is easier to see what is being overlapped and how it works. In Initiation, Alan creates some form of foreshadowing, focuses on some symbol within the story, and then pushes that symbol through to Saga on the other side. In Return, Saga takes that symbol and uses it to unlock the overlap, where the lines between the manuscripts are blurry and weak, and then uses that weakness to defeat something. Consider the overlap between the Ocean View Hotel segments. It is unlike how it was in Control. It is differently presented in both manuscripts. For Alan, it is an actual hotel. The Cult of the Word staged a play there about a murder that ended with an actual massacre. It continues the themes of fiction within fiction, media about media, self-aware and self-fulfilling loops of mixed media art. The intended victim is the lead actress, an older woman who knew the one who wrote the original work on which the play is based, which is, of course, Thomas Zane. Scratch, the director, murders her in the bathtub. In Bright Falls, Cynthia Weaver is living out her twilight years at the Valhalla retirement home, built by Barry Wheeler for the Old Gods of Asgard with money from their album sales. She has lost Tom's angel lamp, the one that the clicker came from. She is unwell, dying. Her despair over her loss of personal history and the diminishment of her future makes her vulnerable to the dark presence. In her bathtub, the darkness drowns her. She becomes taken. Alan sends through a record of the Old Gods of Asgard for Saga to play on the jukebox, opening up the overlap. Cynthia Weaver is down in a World War II-era bunker that local kids jokingly refer to as the Ocean View Motel, which actually isn't unreasonable. There are lots of these things along the Pacific Northwest coastline, built to hold off an invasion that never arrived. What's being overlapped in this case is Thomas Zane's influence, being empowered or fought off by creative works from different artists. The basement of the Valhalla home is full of Zane's old stuff, articles and clippings about him, a trailer for his film Nightless Night. Cynthia Weaver and Rose Marigold, who are, after all, both versions of each other, overlap each other within the Valhalla home. The places linked through the overlap are a push and pull of ideas, a hotel of death where that death has already consumed the guests, and a home for the dying where there is still life yet remaining to be lived. Then there's the overlap between Coffee World and Watery and the movie theater in the Dark Place. In this case, what is being overlapped are the cults. In the Dark Place, Alex Casey is lured by the cult leaders who are performing a ritual to summon Alan by sacrificing 2 corrupt cops who have done their bidding. And lo, Alan appears. In Bright Falls, Saga discovers the headquarters of the Cult of the Tree, and that the 2 deputies she met in the opener are involved. They become taken, and to follow them, she must reconstruct a parade float based on local folklore where one brother kills another. To complete it, Saga needs a moose skull, which Alan finds in the projection room of the theater. On both sides of the overlap, fiction transforms and destroys someone. On Saga's side, the folklore starts to come true, and the Koskela brothers who head the cult are torn apart by death. On Alan's side, Alex Casey is destroyed by the knowledge that he is fictional, that he is trapped in a loop, that he will always, always, always die in that alleyway. The Cult of the Word will win, and the Cult of the Tree will lose. Within the overlap, though, is a surprise. Saga receives supernatural help from Ati. The manuscripts are powerful, they are consumptive, but there are other beings out there that fight against it, that live in parallel with what Alan is doing. Saga is one of them, and her presence is what brings many of the others together. The first revelation comes early. Saga Anderson is granddaughter to Tor and Odin Anderson. She is an inheritor of their magic, their resistance to the dark presence. In the Valhalla nursing home, they teach her that her mind place and her profiling technique are both a form of that magic, that she is a seer, that she is not just a good detective, she is also what the Federal Bureau of Control would call a para-utilitarian. Saga's connection to Tor and Odin transform the way that they're incorporated into the story. No longer just comedy relief, they feel like real people. They care for Saga and want her to succeed in a very kind and empathetic way. By taking on mentor roles for Saga, they are able to shape the way she grows as the hero of the story. She starts off as being competent and confident. She doesn't become any weaker over the course of the story and never willingly allows herself to be the victim, but she does start off as a mundane character from an unmagical world. She is a novice to the supernatural. In those areas, she is a little lost, a true beginner. Tor and Odin let her tap into her true potential, and more than that, they know Logan did not drown, that Saga is meant to be married, that her life is still out there waiting to be restored. They make her feel sane and remind her that there is still much to fight for. The Anderson brothers also feel much more sympathetic in their own right. 2 old men who have lived hard and well, who have visited distant supernatural shores, partied across decades of history, seen a million faces, and rocked them all. To defeat Scratch, they have to play a new song, which creates the mechanical climax of the game. Things take a while to resolve afterwards narratively, but the hardest part of Alan Wake 2 by far is the summoning sequence. One reason is that it's a deliberate echo of the stage defense sequence in Alan Wake 1, a parallel that the dialogue of the game itself draws later. The second is that these are 2 kinds of art in conflict, 2 conflicting intentions, 2 conflicting mediums. They have to clash in a dramatic way. That's just art. On the one hand is Alan's story, dark, egocentric, cruel, narrative. On the other is Old Gods of Asgard's music, triumphant, collaborative, kind, emotional. The summoning brings Alan out of the dark place, but it also does so out of sequence. When he shows up in the early chapters on the shore of Cauldron Lake, it is because of this song and this moment. Just like how the time frame of when Alan and Saga speak in the overlaps does not align in a linear way. Alan, however, has an additional tormentor within the game, Warlin Dor. Dor has an unusual interest in Alan. He both dislikes him and would prefer he fail, but must help Alan succeed in spite of this. He might have been played by Lance Reddick like Martin Hatch in Quantum Break, but when Lance Reddick passed away, Dor had to be recast. David Harewood was a fantastic choice for it. Lance Reddick was an absolute legend, but he was a familiar face, a known vibe. What Harewood brings to Warlin Dor is a little more mysterious. He is extremely funny when he wants to be, and equally sinister. Dor is introduced as a talk show host in the Dark Place, taunting Alan by putting him on the spot by doing a publicity tour for initiation before he's even written a word of it. Dor's interview has a double purpose. First is that he is explaining the metatextual setup of the plot to the players themselves, especially new players who might not be familiar with the broader Remedy canon and all the many self-referential connections that it has. Second, Dor is guiding Alan to do the work by suggesting that he has already done it. Dor's performance is especially funny because of the extent to which he is toying with Alan. Dor is aware that this is a loop. Alan is not, so Dor can tease the shit out of him with that foreknowledge. Later on, as Alan progresses through initiation, Dor confronts him in a more direct way. Dor is angry with him for getting involved, for hurting someone close to him. My first time around, I thought it would be more clear who that would be, but playing it a second time, I realized, oh, shit, that would be Saga. The Anderson brothers tease it through their dialogue as well. They talk about how they did not get along with Saga's father, how they felt he was bad for her mother, how Odin lost an eye to a disagreement that they had. The timeline of these revelations matches up more or less perfectly with a whiteboard that Sheriff Tim Breaker develops in the Dark Place. Tim is being kept there by Dor, loop after loop, for the sole purpose of delivering Saga one of the manuscript pages at the right time towards the climax of the game. Tim's whiteboard is much like the Alan Wake chalkboard from Quantum Break. It lays out the lore as explicitly as it's possible to, without completely shattering the sense of mystery. Every new chapter of initiation fills out the whiteboard a little more until the hints resemble the full answer. Plus, additionally within the climax, Saga can move through the Dark Place in a way that only Dor, or critically those in the family of Dors, can do. In retrospect, it's pretty clear, but it took me doing the New Game Plus round for it to actually click with me. It's one of many story elements that are actually hidden in plain sight, but with so very many mysteries and so many strange and looping configurations, it can be hard to sort out which puzzle pieces belong to which puzzles. Which, I suppose, is the genius of the Mind Place evidence board. Saga is experiencing the same confusion as I am, and uses cold deduction to corral it and slice through it. I'm not so good at it myself. The Andersons use the art of music to navigate the story. Dor uses the art of manipulation. Saga uses the art of forensics. But they're hardly the only artists involved. By far the most unusual and interesting side character is Alice Wake. She is never seen directly, never interacted with in a straightforward way, but she is the goal of every loop that takes place within initiation. After the discovery of each murder site and the passing of the symbolic object into the overlap, a version of the high-rise apartment seen in the first game's flashbacks manifests itself into being. Within is the work of Alice Wake. Just like an American Nightmare, Alan is terrified that Scratch will break out and kill her. Unlike an American Nightmare, the art is not something that belongs to Alan's imagination and memories. It is really Alice. It is really her work. The apartment is an overlap of sorts in its own right between husband and wife. Scratch has indeed managed to creep into her life, using the darkness and despair of loss to appear as a kind of ghost, haunting her from the margins of her life. But the Dark Place responds to creativity, and Alice harnessed the darkness to create a full art installation out of it, titled, of course, The Dark Place. Alice appears primarily through a series of videos, recording a retrospective look at what has happened to her in the years since Alan's disappearance, how she processed it, how she has confronted the supernatural attacks that she's experienced. By turning it into her own art, she has gained power and mastery over the situation. Throughout the chapters, you see the installation develop from concept to staged rehearsal and finally to a conclusion, a return to Cauldron Lake where she herself dives back in to save him. The installation declares that she died, that this was a suicide. But that's the thing about art. It doesn't have to be true to send the right message. Alice did go into the Dark Place, but that's where she is, manipulating things from somewhere hidden and remote, creating this art installation not so much that others would understand what happened to Alan, but that Alan could understand what happened to her. By convincing Alan that she was dead, she could focus his attention where it needed to be, on ending the story, on saving Saga instead. And meanwhile, she would help Saga save Alan from himself, using the magic of Zane's shoebox to carry her photos over from loop to loop, along with a clicker and an object she crafted through her work called the Bullet of Light. Saga is the hero of the story, but she was an unwilling participant. Alice, on the other hand, is using another kind of magic, another kind of ritual. She has used her art to shape the dark place and edge the story closer and closer to a positive resolution, loop by loop, inch by inch. But if she is working against the story, what of Thomas Zane? What about his artistic collaboration? Thomas Zane is more directly involved in Alan Wake 2 than he ever was in the first game, but in some ways he's equally as powerless. He has to use Alan and Scratch to get what he wants. He has to manipulate the two of them into completing their manuscripts for the ritual to work. The only reason it doesn't work is interference from Alice, Saga, and Dor. All through the initiation chapter, Zane calls Alan on the telephone, John Mira style. Always surprised when Alan remembers him, because that means things can continue and not just get caught in the loop again. Which is even incorporated into the gameplay. Whenever Alan dies, he reawakens briefly in the writer's room. Every single time you, the player, reload a save, you are just skipping to where you left off within a brand new loop. Zane is at the Ocean View Motel, but can only be accessed by going into a video playing on a projector. Tom Zane is, after all, a film artist. That's the world where he has dominance. He would never meet Alan out in the dark place where he doesn't have creative control, never within the manuscript where Alan is the driving creative force. He will only meet with Alan on film, where he can do as he pleases. When Alan refuses to write, Tom just uses Scratch instead to create Return, using the drunk and egotistical side of him to turn out prose in a self-serving haze. It's called Return because we return, Scratch slurs. But then when Alan starts writing again to try and counter Scratch with initiation, Zane uses that too. He lets Alan get angry, lets the writer shoot him in the forehead. But it's fine. On film, after Alan leaves the film reel, he just wipes off the blood and laughs about how dramatic it was. Both versions of Alan suit Thomas Zane's purposes, and he has more or less total control over shaping both of them, which would make sense if they are his creations. I've mentioned how the Anderson brothers and Otti always refer to Alan as Tom, and how the play at the hotel is credited to Tom as the original creator, but by far the strangest and most interesting suggestion that Tom is the primary creative mind behind all of this is the inclusion of a whole-ass film of his, Yoten Yo, or Nightless Night. It has versions of every character, all playing versions of their roles within the game, but slightly mixed up in a way where it is impossible to tell if this is depicting things that have already happened, things that will happen, or a bizarre mix of both. The whole movie theater sequence leading up to it is all about Casey realizing that he is fiction, and here he is, star of a story that he doesn't even remember starring in. Barbara Yager uses Casey as a willing sacrifice to bring her writer back from the Huatari well, back to the world of the living. Is this what has already transpired? Departure brought Alan into the dark place, return spat him back out. Neither manuscript happens without Yager. It is Tom who is trying to return. Just as Alan Wake has gone through numerous drafts and story ideas trying to craft one with the power to actually leave, so must have Tom, and perhaps this is one of his drafts. There are variations of what has happened within Alan Wake 2 and what will happen, some of which point to the ending. Casey is told, this is the ritual to lead you on. He returns, and you are in turn locked in the room. In the climax, the Dark Presence takes Casey over. He storms into the writer's room to stop Alan from completing the ending. Alan absorbs the Dark Presence from him, and only Alice's bullet of light is able to drive the presence out, saving both of them. Without the bullet, perhaps what was foretold in Nightless Night would have transpired. Alan would have returned, Casey would have been locked in the room, narrating Max Payne thrillers forever. The very end of Nightless Night is precisely that. Casey is locked there in the writer's room, dumbstruck with his revelation. It's not a loop. It's a spiral. The whole film is like 15 minutes. Not that long for an actual film, but in terms of standing there watching the damn thing in the theater, it is a lot to ask of players. But if players do watch it, they gain foreknowledge of how the game ends. In the writer's room, trapped again, saying, it's not a loop, it's a spiral. Effectively, what this means is that the loops are leading somewhere. They will get tighter and tighter until they reach some terminus, some center of the spiral, where there will be a resolution. The symbol for Alan Wake in Control and throughout Alan Wake 2 is the spiral. This is not so surprising. But the implications of Nightless Night are so fascinating because it begs the question of where in the spiral we are, precisely. Not at the beginning, certainly, because that looks closer to Yoten Yo, but not even remotely near the end, because Return is not ultimately so different of a work of art. Or perhaps the issue has to do with why Tom needed Alan in the first place. He is not actually so creative or talented as an artist. Tom must invent or entrap a better one. And that's the thing about artists. They're not always so great with deadlines. So I've been talking about the game for somewhere around an hour, and all I've really managed to talk about is the story. Which is easy to understand why. The story is the point and the monster. The narrative puzzles are what is most compelling. The majority of the game is talking or listening or thinking. But it is also a survival horror game. At some point, a person needs to survive and/or be horrified, which raises the question I know some folks will feel I should have addressed ages ago. Is the game actually scary? If it's primarily a maze of meta-narrative hijinks and cryptic self-references, if it's still mostly cheap thrills and pretentious bullshit, can it ever pull itself together enough to actually frighten anyone? Astoundingly, yes. It's actually a considerably scarier game than the first one, and differently so for Saga and Alan. Saga's gameplay is closer to the traditional Alan Wake 1 experience, but tightened and transformed. A player's mobility is severely curtailed compared to the first game. You're not going to be running around all over the place, there's nothing fast-paced about it. There's still a cinematic dodge, but it is harder to trigger. The encounter design has changed so that there are usually always fewer enemies than there would have been in the previous games, but these enemies are much tougher. In Alan Wake 1, once the Darkness Shield had burned away, weapons made truly short work of most enemies. Here, the Darkness Shield is less of a thing, but the resistance to weapons for the enemies is much higher. They just keep advancing, absorbing bullet after bullet. There is a greater sense of desperation, a heightened impression of threat. This interacts with the level design in interesting ways. Once the narrative portions of a major chapter are over, the map opens up for a significant amount of optional exploration. Enemies repopulate these areas every time you backtrack through them, so there is always a slightly unpredictable amount of danger, and with the removal of the zoom-in, zoom-out danger indicator from the first game, there is an omnipresent suggestion of threat. To help balance out the resource drain from the replacement enemies and provide some special tools for help in boss fights and such, there are cult caches all over the place. These always have some sort of little puzzle attached to them. The puzzle breaks help make the exploration feel varied, creating breaks in the tension while you solve them. But there are also all these nursery rhyme puzzles, which all give charms for Saga's bracelet, which have some kind of gameplay effect, like buffs or an instant revive. These puzzles are accomplished by using dolls and symbols to illustrate a small nursery rhyme-style story, but once the puzzle is complete, they typically spawn a number of enemies. So, while the caches are a break from the danger, the rhymes are an invocation of it. What's fun about the rhymes is that they aren't natural magic. It's a deliberate experiment on the FBC's part to use art to provoke the magic of Cauldron Lake, an offshoot of the experimentation that comprises the Lake House DLC. Saga's access to winding outdoor environments with unpredictable enemy groupings and numerous hidden rewards replicates some of the feeling of exploration from the first game, and the environment feels as spooky as it did last time as well. This is the Pacific Northwest at its dampest and weirdest, dark woods and ominous sunsets. The combat has shifted more towards the genre standard for a survival horror game, which creates fear and tension, but the openness of Saga's chapters makes it all a little more intriguing than it is scary. What it's missing is the claustrophobia that so often accompanies this kind of gameplay, a claustrophobia that pretty much defines the combat in Alan's Noir York chapters. The Dark Place has an even more threatening approach to the Taken. They are omnipresent. There are shadows literally everywhere, more than you could ever afford to shoot. But they're like ghosts. Not all of them are really there. Some of them you can walk right on through. Some will be solid and shove you backwards, but will not otherwise interact. And some are the real deal and will properly attack you. The effect of this is a relentless kind of paranoia, exacerbated by their constant whispers. Instead of winding wilderness, the initiation maps are all densely urban, alleyways and hallways and cramped little rooms. Held together, of course, with a dream logic where a stairway downwards might end up with you on a rooftop, where turning a streetlight on and off could add or remove a doorway. It makes enough sense to be navigable, but not so much sense as to ever feel less than a nightmare. There's exploration to be done here as well, with supply cache briefcases and upgrade symbols hidden in out-of-the-way corners, but it's harder to miss things. There really isn't any off-the-beaten path like there is in Saga's chapters. Pretty much every part of the level gets used deliberately. Alan's chapters are much darker in tone, in color, in gameplay, and that makes for the superior horror experience between the two manuscripts. There are a lot of moments that are genuinely unnerving, frightening, and there is a pervasive dread that seeps into every moment of the gameplay. But the different chapters reflect their protagonists. Saga is the hero. She has hope. She is determined to win. There is conflict, but the conflict resolves. For Alan, there is nothing but to be pulled further down the spiral, circling the drain of his own subconscious. But that doesn't mean we can't have a few laughs along the way. I've talked about how amazing the uneven dynamic between Dor and Alan can be, but not the bizarre apex of Dor's sarcastic baiting. A chapter called We Sing, in which we sing. It is musical retelling of the first game and elements of American Nightmare, like a big Broadway-style production with a light show and modular sets and all sorts of shit. In a certain way, it is reminiscent of the Address Unknown Funhouse in Max Payne 2. It takes the serious narrative of the actual game and turns it into a comedic distortion by way of a completely different and frivolous medium. For Max Payne 2, a funhouse was absolutely the satirical way to go, a progression of painted cardboard sets and spring-loaded scares that you walk through and go ooh and ah to on your way to and from the funnel cake concession. For Alan Wake 2, the focus is more narrative and less mechanical, so to make fun of itself, a musical is really the perfect method. If the game can be melodramatic, convoluted, and absurd in its natural context, then putting it into a format where it becomes even more operatically overblown is just funny as hell. The cheesy champion of light, herald of darkness phrasing from American Nightmare actually works oddly well within the context of a musical, where these things are often phrased in a pretty direct way within the lyrics. Like, Wicked is fantastic fun, but you can't accuse it of being especially subtle. Going through the section that's just replaying the first events of the game as an actual stage is just such an intensely clever and fun way to both revisit the events and poke fun at the player's role within it. Just an actor going through the blocking needed to get through to the end of the act. Plus it then becomes kind of a running gag, where Audie hums the song later on, Alan can't quite get it out of his head either, and then later when Alan is in the real world he has to explain to an FBC agent that he knows the Anderson brothers from earlier because they came and played music for his musical, which does not make him sound especially credible. There's also the Koskela brothers. They're the cult leader, sure, but they're also two very goofy guys who have a series of TV ads which are done up with an endearing cheapness for a variety of business ventures and schemes they have going on around town. Being so goofy is an interesting contrast with the whole cult leader thing, but it resolves in a surprisingly reasonable way with the reveal that the Cult of the Tree is fighting against the dark presence, and not for it. Even in the final reveal in the lighthouse, there is a silly little blueprint of how they want to build like a mirror device on top of the lighthouse to make a laser beam sort of thing out of it. It's super cartoonish and juvenile, and that's perfectly in keeping with the other money-making schemes that the Koskelas are involved in. What's clever is that they are not solely comedy relief characters. Scratch kills one of the brothers. The story comes for them just like it comes for everyone. The final Koskela brothers advertisement is done up like there would be banter between the two of them, but the dead brother simply isn't there to provide any of the laugh lines. His absence within the comedic format they established is affectingly tragic and sad. The balance between comedy and tragedy is important, and it's largely grounded in the creative influence of David Lynch's Twin Peaks. All the Alan Wake games draw from Twin Peaks in one way or another, from the tone of dialogue to the construction of the characters, or from the blend of genres to the setting itself. Alan Wake owes a huge amount to Twin Peaks, but it does stand on its own. It is unique in what it's trying to accomplish, even if the creative legacy is pretty pervasive. Especially in the humor, and the tonal balance between quiet absurdism and violent darkness. In an interview with Inverse, Sam Lake said, quote, "Pop culture is this big cauldron of soup that many people put things in, and then we mix it up and we draw inspiration out of it. The biggest thing that a creator can hope is that they end up contributing into the soup for someone else to level things out." Sam Lake being Sam Lake, the language there seems quite intentional. When Alan Wake 2 dipped its witch's ladle into Cauldron Lake to draw from the ocean of the creative unconscious, it wasn't just Tom Zane down there. It was David Lynch, it was Stephen King, it was Poets of the Fall and Mark Danielewski and Poe and 1,000 other artists who creep into the process when one artist is exposed to another. It's an explicit point that Hideo Kojima made with the Death Stranding games. When we express ourselves, we form these webs of connection. We bind ourselves to the works of others through threads of inspiration, criticism, and adaptation. Alan Wake 2 is unusual in how, as an explicitly metatextual story, it is often directly about those webs of connection. But all art is like that implicitly. We draw from what resonates with us. And Alan Wake 2 is nothing if not a resonant work of art. So how does a game this sprawling and strange even bring itself to a close? Well, not surprisingly, in a staggered and uneven sort of way. There are sort of 4 phases to the climax. The player's mechanical climax with the summoning ritual, Alan's return to Bright Falls and his confrontation with the manuscript of Return, Saga's confrontation with the Dark Place, and then finally, the grand resolution in the writer's room, the place where we go further down the spiral. One thing I really liked about Alan's experience in Bright Falls is that I expected it to be, darker. But instead you wind up in the middle of Deerfest on a sunny day. The only problem is that no one is living their own lives. Everyone and everything pivots around the release of Return. Everyone is praising Alan. Everyone is celebrating his book. It is a total egotistical capture of everyone's lives, which absolutely would be the thing that Scratch had always wanted. If Scratch is the person Alan was afraid to be, a completely unbound narcissist, then this is the supernatural apex of that impulse, a truly solipsistic world where he is the only person who's real, the only thing worth talking about, the unquestioned ruler of a kingdom of sycophants. It feels good when people enjoy your work, not gonna lie, it's a motivating factor for me as well. But it can't be all that there is. What shows his character growth from when we first met him in the first game is his willingness to sacrifice the fantasy, to literally defeat his own ego. Of course, that does make the story rather mad. One of the most interesting touches that this game does is to make Saga's experience in the Dark Place much different, opposite from Alan's in a similar way to how it's been all game long. For Saga, her mind place is her refuge, her creative center. The Dark Place turns it against her. Rather than being too full of herself, Saga is attacked by her self-doubts and regrets. All the negative thoughts that she's been repressing are unleashed at once, evidence to be placed on the board as if the worst possible interpretations of herself and her behavior are unalterable fact. It is an incredibly vivid representation of what self-hatred feels like. I've done this. I've taken my worst feelings and twisted them into what look like facts, wielded them as evidence to condemn myself. The darkness literally closes in on her, dimming her world until all that is left is shadow and misery. I don't live like that as much as I used to, but I used to feel that way all the time. The Dark Presence uses the caseboard to attack Saga, but it is also her art, it is her power, and she can use it to fight back. All throughout the Mind Place are tiny reminders of who she is. Awards, trinkets, accolades, memories. They've been there all game long if you've explored around. The Dark Place hides them from Saga, but she knows that they are there, and once rediscovered, they can be used to close the case, powerful evidence in the weighing of facts. In the depths of depression, it is hard to do this, but it's necessary work. Self-hatred is a cognitive distortion. It can cover a person in oily darkness and make them forget who they were, turning them into a shadow of themselves. Horror is a genre where emotional truths are given physical presence, especially the ugly ones. Saga's descent into the Dark Place is especially powerful in this regard. It's a pretty straightforward metaphor, but the directness is sharp. It cuts. To see her defeated is cathartic and uplifting. She doesn't need anything supernatural to do it, she just needs to see herself clearly, with love, with self-acceptance. Once free, she can use the Mind Place to contact Alan after he deals with his own problems. Together they are ready to collaborate on the new ending. Letting go of his egotism allows Alan to accept her help, to admit that he cannot solve this on his own, that his creativity is not enough. This is not his story alone anymore, it is also Saga's. And for Saga, defeating her self-doubt is what allows her to truly be the hero of the story. But it is Alice that solves the situation for them both. She creates the bullet of light. She steals the clicker from Casey when the Dark Presence takes him over. She manages to come into the story from such an indirect angle that she gets to be the Deus Ex Machina for everyone. She has been working towards this for a very long time. Who knows how many loops? She even knows Saga, even if Saga does not know her. She says hello again when Saga picks up the payphone the first time. In this ending, Alan loops on his opening words. Back to the beginning. But he doesn't exactly, does he? He spirals. Alice in the credits talks about her plan to push things a little further every time, how she has already had success with this plan. The true ending of Alan Wake 2 is one loop further down the spiral in a new game plus called The Final Draft. Alice's message sets that up. It's not like The Signal or The Writer for Alan Wake 1, where paid DLC that not many people played are critical for bridging the ending to other games. The Final Draft was free. Players didn't have to pay a dime for the new ending. The approach to DLC was much different for Alan Wake 2. Rather than expand the main story, every paid edition focuses on expanding the role of a side character and strengthening a connection to another Remedy title. The majority of the DLCs are collected as a series of 3 Night Springs episodes, which are all slightly silly experiments in the way that American Nightmare was. But like American Nightmare, they still have a lot to contribute to the overall world building. What's truly remarkable about them is that they are all included within the game world. You can pass into an episode by finding it on a TV in the environment, like Night Springs would play in the background during the first game. This breaks them up and takes them out of the realm of menu content and blends them much more organically with the existing campaign progression. They provide diversions and breaks from the story that makes the entire experience feel much more unpredictable and open. And it begins with the one that most dramatically deviates from the formula. Number 1 Fan, a story by Rose Marigold about Rose Marigold. Personally, I love Rose. She is an unhinged fangirl icon. In the first game, she was more tragic, used and discarded by various supernatural forces, but in Alan Wake 2, she has a much stronger and more manic personality. In the main campaign, she is both a waitress at the diner and a nurse at the Valhalla home. At the Valhalla home, she has this shrine to Alan that's important for exposition, but arguably more important for comedy. While the whole game is rather fixated on whether or not Alan is a good person and whether he deserves redemption, Rose just loves him completely uncritically. She has a slightly sinister element because she's helping Return manifest itself, but like, oh my god, it's Alan's new book, of course she'll help. What kind of monster wouldn't? She won't help Saga until Saga reveals that she's helping Alan, but when that happens, Rose is an open book. She is just the teensiest bit disconnected from reality in a way that is hilariously endearing. All of Saga's weapon upgrades come from lunchboxes that Rose leaves around with manuscript fragments of Alan's, which Rose has placed to help Alan's hero, not knowing who that would be. The lunchboxes have all these little inspirational messages and snippets of fanfiction within them. While just a side joke in the main campaign, the Night Springs episode brings them to life, turns them into reality the same way the magic worked for Alan's manuscript. Which is the heart of the joke, really. Rose's writing is given the same supernatural deference as Alan's. It follows the same rules, it creates the same rhythms. For the magic to work, it has to follow a genre, and fanfiction is a genre all its own. Rose's writing follows every cliché about amateur fanfiction, and the result is one of the funniest half hours of the entire series. The first cliché is author self-insert wish fulfillment, where the protagonist is obviously some kind of idealized version of the self, getting to meet all the important characters, getting to be grander and hotter and better than they might be in real life. Number 1 Fan opens in the diner, where Rose goes about her regular job, but with a twist. She is the most beloved person in the whole town. Everyone wants her advice, and her advice is flawless. Her coffee is immaculate. Her hair is adorable. Everyone thinks so. The color palette has swapped to pink pastel with a kind of lavender filter on everything for an extra kick of girly pop. Alan, as a professional author, lets his ego pervade a huge amount of his writing, but it is more obscured, more indirect. As an amateur author, Rose just goes for it with no filter whatsoever. This is who she wants to be, the best and cutest. Who doesn't, really? If Alan pulls from Stephen King, Rose pulls a bit from some of the most infamously clunky fanfiction memes, the most famous of which is probably a fanfic called My Immortal, where the main character describes herself like this, quote, "Hi, my name is Ebony Darkness Dementia Raven Way, and I have long ebony black hair, that's how I got my name, with purple streaks and red tips that reaches my mid-back and icy blue eyes like limpid tears, and a lot of people tell me I look like Amy Lee. Author's note, if you don't know who she is, get the hell out of here. I'm not related to Gerard Way, but I wish I was because he's a major fucking hottie. I'm a vampire, but my teeth are straight and white. I have pale white skin. I'm also a witch." End quote. Part of why that's so funny is because of its total disregard for any writing convention at all, and part of it is also just the ego involved. It's silly, it's frivolous, and at the same time, it's over-earnest. An author is expected to kind of disguise their enthusiasms a little better. But having them all just laid out like that is also endearing. Ebony, secure your bag. Don't let anyone tell you different. Rose's personal office in the back of the diner is covered in fan art and Alan Wake memorabilia that reinforce her own self-idealized version of her life. A hyper-feminine protector of Alan's legacy and career, his muse, his number 1 fan. But Alan's in trouble. His evil twin brother is out to get him. So what's a girl to do but accessorize with an armory's worth of weapons and stroll down Main Street to the cheers and adorations of the whole town? The magic is strong with Rose because she is following every genre convention by doing so. The genre just doesn't happen to be horror anymore. The episode is the most violent out of all of them because of this. It is primarily a high-volume combat trial where the game throws dozens and dozens of enemies at you in quick succession. They are not taken, they are haters. The rude and crude losers who can't or won't recognize that Alan is a creative genius. There is no darkness shroud, but they are extra tough. Rose has the power of love, but she also has the power of shotgun, which is equally useful in these situations. The DLC is explicitly about just having fun and being loose with the rules, which is a fundamental aspect of fanfiction also. There is never meant to be a doubt about whether Rose will win. She is going to save Alan, period. The conflict is just that all these haters underestimate her resolve. Instead of Scratch, the evil twin brother is a hot werewolf. Obviously. He rides a motorcycle with flaming wheels, the trail of which Rose can follow. What I think is most clever and fascinating about all this is how it's a creative contrast to American Nightmare. American Nightmare was also the work of an author doing amateurish wish fulfillment, but it was very masculine-coded, with Alan's little harem of women he could save and explain things to. The tone of the dialogue in Number One Fan is just as absurd as it is in American Nightmare, but the jokes land so much better because it's shorter, tighter, and much more clear about its comedic frame. This is the same sort of satire, but inverted. Alan is no longer the author of the satire, he is the object of the satire. It is no longer implied that he is a bad writer, it is insisted upon in cursive with hearts that he is the best author. And through that insistence, his actual deficiencies are so much better illuminated. When Rose defeats the twin brother, she does not kill him. She would never hurt Alan that way, or any version of Alan. So the werewolf admits that he was just jealous of Alan's talent, and that Alan has the love of someone so amazing as Rose. It's such an excellent distillation of Rose's optimism. If only the villain could see what she sees, they would just apologize and everything would be fine. Despite being such a fan of horror and crime thrillers, Rose is completely incapable of seeing the world that way. Even though, in the real world, she goes out into the woods at night with a gun and a flashlight hunting for Taken, like the Cult of the Tree do. Those deer masks, though. Ugh, no thank you. Number One Fan is by far the most straightforward of all three of the Night Springs DLCs. It has no guile, no hidden messages, no secret connections, not even to other Remedy games. This one is just for fun. It's just for Rose, expanding her character from the hastily sketched version from the first game and the minor side character she is in the second one to a core part of the canon. Without Cynthia Weaver, Thomas Zane could never have accomplished a departure. He could not do his magic without a helper, an acolyte, a Number One Fan. What will Alan accomplish in the future that he could not without Rose's help? It's hard to say, but I think it's worth noting that Number One Fan also ends the same way that American Nightmare did. Having saved the object of her affections, Rose dips the writer for a passionate kiss. This isn't any more real than the big screen movie kiss Alan shared with Alice in the previous game, but that doesn't matter to fiction, and especially not to fan fiction. Emotional truth is never more than a page away from actionable reality in Night Springs. The second episode is a crossover with Control that I feel is very much the weakest of the DLCs. Called North Star, it is a reimagining of sorts of some of the basic plot beats of Control, where Jesse Faden comes looking for her brother in a hostile supernatural environment. In this case, the environment is Coffee World. All of the DLCs besides the Lake House reuse parts of the maps from the main campaign, but North Star does it in a way that doesn't even really recontextualize anything. This is the same map with the same kind of enemies. Jessie's new characterization doesn't really work for me either because it's essentially who she is at the very start of Control with none of the character growth. She feels slightly stunted and flat compared to her character in something like the Alan Wake expansion. The setup is a little flat also. Rather than bringing the Alan Wake vibe into Control, it tries to bring the Control vibe into Alan Wake by converting the hiss into a coffee-born madness. There's a conspiratorial coffee brewing company that uses some of the symbols of the board from Control. They have taken over the warehouse, and there's some suggestion that Jessie might find her brother within. None of this is new, and even in the remixing of some of these elements, there's no real revitalization of them. It's darker, and for whatever reason, greener than Coffee World was the first time around. There are some caches to find, but even if you find one or two of the supply caches, you're pretty much set for items. The combat situation is slightly tweaked. Your pistol can fire as fast as you can hit the trigger, like it was in Control. so there's sort of an attempt at rebalancing the rhythm of combat in that direction. But the enemy count is pretty low. So the actual danger situation is that it's fast, heavy, but sporadic and easily surmountable. Northstar, I feel, is just kind of a missed opportunity from top to bottom. It is funny, at least. Turning the hiss into a coffee conspiracy hits pretty well on the axis of absurdism that Control typically operates on. I growl, "You are coffee," to myself a lot of mornings. It does get stuck in your head a bit. But that's it. A few good jokes. It's not nearly as funny as Number One Fan, it's not half as creative as Timebreaker, it isn't as good of a Control crossover as The Lake House. The ending is not the worst. Tim Breaker is here, but the coffee gets him in the end, and then the big reveal, Jesse's brother isn't here, but Alan is. All Roads Lead to Alan is not the worst ending possible. It's a common theme in the Remedy universe of games, but it's also the same ending as Timebreaker, and Timebreaker does it way better. To be honest, the whole thing is so slight, so muddled and ineffectual, that I feel like I must be missing something. If literally everything else in Alan Wake 2 is much more clever and well-constructed than this, maybe it's a me problem. I don't really think so. I played it twice and had the same feeling of disappointment. Maybe I did miss something, or failed to appreciate something. Or maybe it's just that this DLC needed a little more time to percolate altogether. The wild thing about Northstar's disappointment as a Control crossover is that The Lake House is one of the best DLCs that Remedy has ever done. It is considerably better than the Alan Wake expansion for Control, and is actually significantly scarier as a horror game than the majority of Alan Wake 2. It seems like the tighter a survival horror experience can be designed, the more directorial control it preserves over a player's inventory and progression, the better it is at creating tension. The early Resident Evils were all this way, with extremely curated progressions, limited environments, and strict inventory caps. There was rarely, if ever, any getting ahead possible for the player due to the fact that there wasn't really any such thing as an optional area. Every part of the game environment was critical, even side rooms. The Lake House follows this tradition to the letter. It is a massive intensification of the survival horror gameplay loop that the main campaign revolves around, but without any of the optional exploration and loot caches that gives the player an edge. It is mean, it is dark, it is utterly relentless. In this way, it is basically the perfect crossover of Alan Wake and Control. Control couldn't alter its gameplay enough in the AWE to be this frightening, it just altered its environment to be more oppressive. But the Lake House is able to do both at once, and it does them spectacularly. The Lake House is a permanent research facility on the shores of Cauldron Lake, where the Federal Bureau of Control researches Alan's manuscripts and the lake's effect on other artists. Two married scientists, the Marmonts, are in charge of the research, and each leads a separate investigation. But the darkness in the lake has changed them. They have become utterly hateful towards each other, each convinced the other is a weak pretender as a scientist, and if they can just push their own avenue of investigation to greater extremes, they can beat out the other. I had mentioned earlier that this DLC is a fascinating mirror of the themes that the first game explored in the chapter with Emil Hartmann's Artist's Retreat, but the extent of it is genuinely impressive. The Marmonts are the villains, the true monsters of the piece, but the art that's creating such misery and killing so many people isn't Alan's manuscripts, it's Rudolph Lane's paintings. One of the Marmonts focused on live subjects, kidnapping artists and holding them against their will to try and see if the dark presence within the lake would react to them. The more miserable they were, the stronger the result. So the experiment embraced a darkly ironic proposition. If the tortured artist is a trope that has demonstrable, testable results, what would happen if we actually properly tortured them? Rudolph Lane's landscapes were a joy he painted only for himself. They were not marketable like Hartmann wanted, and so Hartmann dismissed and discarded him until his works turned dark. Now the Marmonts did the same thing, for essentially the same reasons. Art that was not actionable or results-oriented for others was deemed useless, and the artist was twisted into a shape which would produce what the producers wanted. Lane became so miserable that the darkness of Cauldron Lake took him and swallowed him whole. He used his blood and body to paint one last abstract self-portrait that held all of his rage and despair. That painting grew to engulf the whole facility. Now, painted monsters come out of the walls, impossible to kill except with a special weapon you only get halfway through the DLC, with very limited ammunition that uses projectiles made out of black rock, that supernatural mineral that came from the oldest house in Control. The painted monsters are genuinely frightening. They have a real Junji Ito quality to them, truly unnatural and unnerving. Not being able to kill them at all for most of the DLC, and even then being only able to kill a few of them, puts a lot of pressure on player resources. All that wasted ammo until a player figures out that the attack is useless, all that wasted health from trying to run away and still being caught. This mechanical pressure is paired with encounters with more traditional Taken enemies, which come at the player in swarms. Agent Estevez must deal with much larger groups of enemies than either Alan or Saga, and she has to do it with far fewer resources. The level of danger and aggression is truly intense. I spent the majority of the DLC limping along in a low health state the first time I played, and pretty close to that margin the second time, even though I knew what I was in for. It's difficult to feel bad for the scientists for getting consumed by the darkness. They were being so unethical as to have basically invited Cauldron Lake in through the front door, but god damn are they frightening in packs. There's a sequence where you go through one of the floors one way, where they are all locked in offices, leering and growling and screaming, and then you open every door at once to progress and have to come right back through them all. It is such a wonderful, effective bit of level design and encounter design. The control-style facility offers such a cool tonal contrast from the small-town, big-city dynamic of the main campaign. It is much darker and more claustrophobic than even Alan's campaign. It completely lacks even the small amount of breathing room that the streets, alleyways, and rooftops of Noir York provided. It is bedrock, traditional survival horror, done up as lean and mean as humanly possible, but with all the cleverness and metatextuality of Alan Wake 2 intact, with the otherworldly contrast of the supernatural and the bureaucratic that Control perfected on top of it. Between every floor, Estevez confronts Lane. It is impossible not to see him, despite how monstrous he has become, as sympathetic. The scientists didn't want sweet pastoral landscapes. They didn't want the art of personal satisfaction or the art of quiet happiness. They wanted art that the dark place would react to, the kind of art that's drenched in blood, inked in pain. And they fucking got what they wanted. With all this darkness and death, it can be easy to lose sight of the Lake House's most peculiar accomplishment. Like the other DLCs before it, it is extremely funny when it wants to be. It's just that the Lake House's humor is full of bitter, sarcastic irony and not the straightforward jokes of the other content. That humor is mostly centered around the other department, which is working tirelessly to replicate the magic of Alan's manuscript. They have done this primarily through imitation and automation. The central irony is that, to the scientists, there is no reason that art should not be a science. If there are effects from the art, those effects should be quantifiable. All this dark place nonsense is far too focused on vibes when it ought to be focused on results. So all over the place are these absolutely hilarious documents attempting to tackle the impossible, to answer the question of what is art with simple theorems and Excel spreadsheets. If Hartman was a satire on the impulses of a producer to insert themselves in the middle of a creative process, The Lake House is an absolutely savage critique of the audacity that modern tech industries have in trying to create machines that imitate and replace the creative process entirely. There is a whole floor within The Lake House that is an explicit satire of large language models. The question for scientists is, why does Alan's magic work and ours doesn't? Why does his art produce emotion? What makes it magic or special when we can do basically the same thing? And the keyword there is basically. There is a whiteboard charting the development of different algorithms to try to imitate Alan's style, all of them coming up short, either spouting off total nonsense or utter banalities. Is it the content that does the magic? Maybe not. Maybe it's his typewriter. So the machines making the false manuscripts are all these big clackety devices that press the keys of actual typewriters, all the same brand and year that Alan used. Oops, no magic there. The scientists simply cannot understand why Alan has the juice, even though he is a mediocre artist working primarily with known cliches. There must be some combination of tropes or order of words which will trick the dark place, which will effectively imitate real emotion, intention, and meaning in a way that works. The Marmonts are mocked in this effort by the appearance of actual pages from Alan's manuscript, which incorporate the Lake House as a side plot into Return. These pages not only mock them by being real magic, the pages mock them personally by showing them to be the bitter, petty people they have allowed themselves to become. Art, as they say, shines a light. In turning from that illumination, the Marmonts let the darkness in, and the whole endeavor sinks below the currents of Cauldron Lake. It is such beautifully clever, biting work. AI boosters will constantly talk about how the imitations it makes are indistinguishable from real art, how no one really cares, but that's a viewpoint that is equally dehumanizing and untrue. Art is communication. It has to come from someone who wants to say something, even if it is cliché, even if it is sloppy. An AI-driven large language model is completely incapable of intent. It has no experience that it wishes to share. It has no influences it finds meaningful. It has no capacity to even grasp meaning whatsoever. And so it will find the magic of art forever outside its grasp, no matter how much money is spent on it or however much prose is fed into it for reference. LLMs are inherently vampiric that way. They have to feed off of real artists with actual talent. If you feed AI slop back into AI, the whole thing rapidly degrades. It loses any coherency it might have had in the first place. Which is the only sort of victory it can hope to achieve, that the words make sense when read in order. It will only ever be content. It can never be art. It will never even rise to the level of an egotistical New York mediocrity who wears hoodies underneath sport coats. Alan Wake games are often satirical, but I think The Lake House is the only instance that I've seen where the satire is so deliberately, righteously caustic. It is not just poking good-natured fun at AI LLMs, it is ripping them an entirely new asshole. And I love to see it. It makes absolute sense for a game series whose entire reason for being is to metatextually explore what it is to create and how that affects our sense of reality, to want to offer commentary on this new, dangerous threat to artistic expression. For the tech oligarchs in charge of this shit, they literally cannot conceive of why imitation is not enough. What they steal should be enough to make it work. Who they hurt should be enough to fuel the machine. And yet, there is no magic. Just typewriters stretching endlessly into empty rooms. Alan Wake 2, like Alan Wake himself, is not always especially subtle, but it knows exactly what it wants to say, and it can summon up the most powerful possible imagery to convey it. That is how the magic is done. Of course, where it can be cutting, it can also be intensely playful. Timebreaker, the final Night Springs episode, is where the meta-narrative reaches its most hilarious intensity, going off on narrative tangents far beyond the concerns of Alan Wake 2 and doing its damnedest to tie the entire Remedy-connected universe together in a tight, half-hour experience. It begins with a conversation between Shawn Ashmore and Sam Lake. Like, the actual people. Ashmore was the actor who played Jack Joyce, the lead role in Quantum Break, as well as Sheriff Tim Breaker here in Alan Wake 2. Sam Lake, well, we are already familiar with. If all Timebreaker did was to tie that universe to this one, that would be fine, but it goes so much harder than that. Shawn is, in this new narrative, the leading man again. He's discussing his role with Sam Lake, who describes it like, he's a multiversal agent who goes by many names as there are many versions of him. Breaker, Branch, others. He is searching for his lost love, while his ruthless nemesis, Door, the master of many worlds, is murdering versions of him across parallel realities. Ashmore says it sounds like Lake has his own vision for the multiverse, and Lake replies, the right vision, the truth, it's all out there somewhere. That's where these ideas and inspirations come from. They seep through, somewhere. This here, us talking, is part of a video game, and another version of you is playing it. Somewhere, your character, the agent, is real, and he could appear here through a portal any time now. Which is, of course, exactly what happens. One of his alternate versions shows up dead, and then an alternate version of Courtney Hope, the actress who played Beth Wilder in Quantum Break and Jesse Faden in Control, shows up to push him over the threshold into full meta-narrative freefall. The leading man must fill the role he was destined to play, which is a plot at least as old as Three Amigos and never fails to hit. What's so particularly special about this DLC is the way it redefines that role between various games and how far it dials out the consequences. Shawn Ashmore does not appear in Control at all, but in Quantum Break, his character and Hope's character have a romantic subplot. Timebreaker takes this thread and weaves it into a suggestion that this is a repeating pattern, that they are fated lovers, or at least friends in some of the timelines. It's for this reason that Tim Breaker appears in the North Star episode of Night Springs. Even in the main campaign, the red-headed woman is part of Tim's whiteboard scrawl. The biggest interaction that they have together outside of Quantum Break is mostly here in this DLC, in a comic book section. Because not only does this multiverse stretch across narrative variations, it changes its own medium as it pleases. It is prose, it is film, it is a video game, it is a comic book, It is a story about creation and therefore encompasses all creative mediums at once in an infinite universe of imaginative possibility. Here, Courtney Hope plays a different version of Jesse working for a different version of the FBC called the Ripple Effect Corporation, itself a reference to Quantum Break and the ripple effects that slightly altered the film episodes if you can find them within the environment. Just as the Alan Wake expansion was a prologue for Alan Wake 2, it seems to me that this all has to be a setup for things that will come in Control 2. It has taken the potential appearance of Shawn Ashmore in that game universe from basically a possible cameo to a cosmic certainty. And it vastly expands the role of Door, giving him a concrete backstory. Door was actually already referenced back within Control, where Dylan Faden beseeched him for help spreading the hiss and Door refused. In Timebreaker, it's explained within the comic that Door was the victim of a supernatural accident that destroyed every other version of himself in the multiverse, except for him. But this had the inverse effect of giving this singular version of himself access to every other dimension and world simultaneously. This is why he isn't affected by Alan's story. He is far beyond its scope and reach. Door is being set up through this DLC and the main campaign to be such an important character going forward, a key villain. But just like the characters played by Ashmore and Hope are fated lovers, he and Ashmore are fated enemies. Just like in Quantum Break, they will always be in opposition. Which is true within Alan Wake 2, of course. Door really fucks up Tim Breaker's life by sending him to the dark place. What's especially funny about Timebreaker is that it gives the literal actor Shawn Ashmore primacy within his various incarnations. Jack Joyce fought Martin Hatch to prevent the end of time, but Ashmore chases Door to the literal end of all universes and beyond. He's the one to really do it. The only problem is that he is misunderstanding Door's role in all of this. He thinks Door is the master of many worlds, which, considering Door's powers, only makes sense. But just as Hope and Ashmore's characters are meant to find one another, their respective DLCs arrive at the same conclusion. No matter how twisting the path, all roads lead back to Alan Wake. The end of the universe is a strange, foggy scrapyard. Heaps and heaps of polyhedron reality shifters lay discarded in the ancient sand. It is one of the coolest, weirdest images in the game as a whole. Quiet, dark, a place of terminal decay. It is as far as a journey into the multiverse can take a person, to the point where all possibilities have been exhausted, where all configurations have been tried, where resolution is only found because there is nothing left to resolve. How then to come back from this? Well, by going back to the beginning. In this case, the beginning of the whole creative universe. As a video game, this also means going back to one of the earliest possible formats of video games, the text adventure. Long before there was Alan Wake, there was Colossal Cave Adventure, released in 1976, the distant primordial past of video games. The text of this adventure in Timebreaker reads, "In the beginning there was the Word. Here only words exist. They are everything. They describe the world and you in it." Alan Wake, although a game about a writer, has always had visuals and gameplay and all sorts of multimedia elements to distract from the writing itself. But the writing is still the core. All imagination needs to build out an entire world, a universe, a multitude of universes, is words. They are the very beginning of everything. If you peel absolutely every voice line and player input and rendered frame away, there is still the script, and the script can evoke it all. The text adventure in Timebreaker is short, 10 or 15 minutes long, but it branches out in insanely variable ways. Which is easy. The developers are offloading almost the entire production process onto the player and the player's imagination, all the rendering and processing and animation and lighting. As pure text, it is more creatively free than it ever could be as a AAA video game. I played through twice and had completely divergent experiences, with some overlap. In one, I wandered through the desert of the mind until I was given a seed by my future self. I planted it, and it became the world tree. All realities hung in its branches, all possibilities. In another playthrough, I sided with Jezbet to create the Ripple Effect Corporation. I turned it into something that could defeat Door, had an epic battle, and lost. But the oldest house, which contains both the REC and FBC, is the World Tree. I was, in a way, on a similar path in that playthrough. It's what Sam Lake said at the very beginning. His vision of the multiverse is a creative truth. It all seeps in, it all mixes together in that big old cauldron of the imagination. So many creative works from so many creators contain shades of the same thing, variations on a theme, new songs to old beats, new stories with familiar morals. Sam Lake is not just here in the DLC after all, he appears on Door's show at the very beginning of the game, telling Alan what a fan he is of the Alex Casey thrillers, doing the Max Payne face, just like he did in his interview appearance in the first game. He is tied up in the movie theater under a deer mask, taunting Alan, "Oh no, please don't stab me with a conveniently placed knife." There is an image on Reddit you can look up that someone put together that tracks all the various choices in the text adventure, and the web is just absolutely enormous. But they all taper inwards at the end. They all converge. They all arrive at a door, just not the door you were looking for. You open it up, and there is the writer's room. There is Alan Wake, the true master of many worlds. But of course, behind Alan Wake is Sam Lake. He is also a master of many worlds, but he understands the genre. The story has to follow the genre for the magic to work, and the author should not directly self-insert into their own works as the full-fledged protagonist. Even when Stephen King did it, he was a side plot. When Sam Lake does it, he is an impish, winking presence along the sidelines. The story would not work if Sam Lake himself was the master of many worlds, despite however true that might be. Thomas Zane could not escape the dark place without Alan, and neither can Sam Lake articulate the dark place properly without Alan. Alan holds it together, the words that form the beginning, the spiral towards the end. The idea of the oldest house being the world tree was already explored within Control, most explicitly in its DLC Foundation. To understand where the Alan Wake games might go from here, it's helpful to go back and examine how it all connects backwards that way, to see the world tree spreading its branches. The tree imagery is present all over the place in Alan Wake 2, like at the transition to the crime scene in Caldera Street Station. Control has branches that weave into all sorts of creative works. Like early in the main campaign, we have the flamingo from Address Unknown perched atop a TV. It leads to a bizarre creature from the astral plane called the Former, presumably a former member of the mysterious board of directors that guides Jesse and the FBC. The Former is your ally within the Foundation DLC. It tries its best to guide Jesse and give advice contrary to the board's wishes. It is so mysterious and strange. But is it a coincidence that its eye is like the bulb and lens of a flashlight, piercing the darkness all around? There are few, if any, coincidences within the game world. In the real world, coincidences happen all the time, but in a creative world, even an accidental coincidence is likely rooted somehow in a conscious or subconscious expression, a manifested intent. Even when artists don't think they mean anything in particular, they make a choice, they have a preference. There is some reason why things were one way and not the other. Even when the author meant nothing by one of these choices, the audience might ascribe meaning to it, meaning which changes their experience. This is especially true of something so metatextual as Alan Wake. This idea is widely referred to as death of the author, coined by literary critic Robert Barths in a 1967 essay. Barth writes, quote, "The author, when we believe in him, is always conceived as the past of his own book. The book and the author take their places of their own accord on the same line, cast as a before and an after. The author is supposed to feed the book, that is, he pre-exists it, thinks, suffers, and lives for it. He maintains with his work the same relation of antecedence that a father maintains with his child. Quite the contrary, the modern writer is born simultaneously with his text. He is in no way supplied with a being which precedes or transcends his writing. He is in no way the subject of which the book is a predicate. There is no other time than that of the utterance, and every text is eternally written here and now." End quote. It might be possible to describe the entire character of Alan Wake as an author who is born simultaneously with his text. He is a fictional realization of Barth's essential critique. The world of Control, the character of Jesse Faden, and the concept of the oldest house as the world tree on which the branches of reality grow can be considered to be the structure on which the Remedy-connected universe rests. What you see in Control is assumed to be true, in a way. Even in its supernatural sci-fi world-building, there is an assumption that what you see is some form of an actionable reality. The astral plane is somewhere beyond regular reality, but it too is tangible. It has inhabitants. These inhabitants have their own motives. They work as actors outside of the story, like Door or the Anderson brothers. The foundation of foundation are the roots of the world tree, the things about the creative universe which must be agreed on for the storytelling to work. But Alan Wake is different. It is subject to every possible form of subjectivity. The Dark Place is a version of reality where subjectivity literally shapes and reshapes the entire world in endless spirals and loops. Barths goes on to say, quote, We know that a text does not consist of a line of words, releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but is a space of many dimensions, in which are wedded and contested various kinds of writing, no one of which is original. The text is a tissue of citations, resulting from thousands sources of culture. Once the author is gone, the claim to decipher a text becomes quite useless. To give an author to a text is to impose upon that text a stop clause, to furnish it with a final signification, to close the writing. This conception perfectly suits criticism, which can then take as its major task the discovery of the author, or his hypostases, society, history, the psyche, freedom. Beneath the work, once the author is discovered, the text is explained, the critic has conquered. Hence, it is scarcely surprising not only that historically the reign of the author should have been that of the critic, but that criticism, even new criticism, should be overthrown, along with the author." End quote. What is the Federal Bureau of Control if not an attempt to do exactly this, to impose upon a creative reality a final signification, to use science and bureaucracy to conquer that which is inherently wild and unknowable? Barthes is saying, essentially, that even as a critic, he does not know shit. He does not have any greater truth than any given reader, that all interactions between art and audience are unique unto themselves and ungovernable by any sort of academic finality. I agree with this. I have done my best to explain what I've gotten from the Alan Wake games, and it doesn't make me right, but it doesn't make me wrong either, so long as I write the truth of my own relationship with the art. As a game critic, I think that that's what I've always strived to do. There was a popular push a few years back for game critics to be objective, as if such a thing was possible, but it was always going to fail because the impulse is simply antithetical to treating art as art. You can be objective about whether or not a washing machine washes clothes and how well. There is no final interpretation and no objectivity when it comes to something like Alan Wake or Control. There is only the art, the audience, and the provocation of resonance between them. Alan Wake may be the master of many worlds, but we are not his subjects. We never have been, and the suggestion that we might be subjugated by the story in this way has been the heart of the horror all along. So, then, we come to the end of it. The final draft. The last looping circuit of the long spiral, at least for now. This last New Game Plus playthrough doesn't radically transform the majority of the campaign, but it does do quite a bit to reseason it with small additions and asides that help close out the story of this game and tease elements of where the story might go from here. By making the characters conscious of the loop, it becomes the spiral. Change becomes possible. The story is materially different than the previous draft, in which these repetitions were unperceived and innumerable. Alan's opening narration changes to be hopeful. This is not just monsters and villains. It has a hero. There is hope. They will go through the darkness and emerge into the light. Perhaps this makes it less of a horror story, but such a shift is necessary in order to move on. In terms of just the experience of a New Game Plus, I probably would not have done it if not for the new ending it provides. Alan Wake 2 is just not mechanically focused enough to make the inventory carryover feel meaningful. I was playing the Dead Space remake recently and almost immediately went back in for round 2 because I wanted to dismember those fuckers at maximum speed and savagery. I kinda wanted to see if I could do the game in close to half the time. That's just not the kind of game experience Alan Wake 2 is, or ever has been. As a story about stories, the joy of it is recontextualization and narrative progress, to be able to fit the pieces together better and to add in new pieces and make the picture complete. Some things are small. There are new manuscript pages throughout, but only a few of them really matter to the story. Most changes are small, like this page giving Saga a sense of déjà vu, pushing her towards awareness of the loop. A bigger change within the story are the new television segments within the Dark Place. Alan has a new Writer's Journey segment that's especially important. Throughout the game, the Writer's Journey tapes have been a descent into madness that's very reminiscent of the state of mind that he was in during the Alan Wake 1 DLC episodes, on the verge of total manic collapse. They are all retrospective within Alan Wake 2, taking place before he started initiation. The journey is the process through which he stopped writing and came around to the idea that he could not escape the act of creation, even if he tried. And, wow, did he try. Something kind of funny that happened to me making this video is that I tried incredibly hard to get it done in time for Halloween and failed. I was writing so much and so constantly that I stopped taking care of myself for a while and kind of monomaniacally focused on just getting words done. In rewatching some of the clips of the writer's journey, I was like, wow, I did this. I tried to critique a meta-narrative about how you shouldn't let your work consume you completely and drown in it by letting it metatextually consume me and completely drowning in it. Big oops. Bad vibes. By the time my wife had to ask me, "Are you really going to let this ruin Halloween for you?" I knew I had to check myself. But it was already too late. I had already done the most ironic thing I could have possibly done. I spiraled out. It'll happen to you. For Alan Wake himself, the new video segment has him reflecting on the non-linear nature of time in the dark place. Loops beyond loops, where the past is guided by a future self, even more omnipotent, even more impossible. This is, interestingly, an echo of a note you can find in the Foundation DLC for Control, where the cave paintings the scientists find are predated by artifacts that the scientists themselves have left behind. Time works weird along the world tree. Past or present or future, the links of causality are very blurry. Control influences the final draft in other ways, too. Dr. Casper Darling is down here. In Control, he's the scientist most ahead of the others in multiversal research, and he has already disappeared during the events of Control. He ended up here, in the dark place. At one point, he tunes a radio in to hear Alan's narration. If this is a dream, that is surely the voice of the dreamer, which sounds like him for some reason. That reason, of course, being that he and Alan are indeed the same actor. Ilka Villi is the physical actor, but Matthew Pereda is the voice actor for Alan Wake. Pereda is both physical and a voice actor for Darling. To escape the dark place, he needs an artist's help. Thomas Zane then immediately appears with a cocktail and a proposition. At the end of Control, he asked Alan for a collaboration. Now he asks Darling. If Alan's manuscripts did not help Zane the way he wanted, if the story did not go according to plan because of Saga's intervention, he will turn to science for the help that he needs. This makes the lake house more important in retrospect because whatever collaboration that happens between the two of them will likely look somewhat similar, some kind of unholy fusion between self-aggrandizing artistic mediocrity and self-effacing scientific empiricism. Whatever the two cook up, I'm excited to see it, and based on the flirtatious vibe between them, I'd say Darling is too. For the protagonists of Alan Wake 2, they also need outside saviors to come in and pull them up from the depths. For Saga, it's the Anderson brothers and Ahti. In the main campaign, the brothers leave the real world to disappear under Cauldron Lake, going off to help Saga. They don't actually arrive at their destination until the final draft, where they are there to offer comforting words to assure Saga that Ahti will offer a way out through his mop bucket. Which sounds absurd, but the mop bucket is how the player transferred from one story to another all game long. Ahti will simply make the magic work for Saga in a more explicit way. For Alan, of course, it's Alice that pulls him out. Alice comes through so much stronger in the final draft. Every visit to Parliament Tower has Alan discovering one of her photographs in the elevator. Each photo brings him closer to the surface, closer to her. After closing the loop, there is a further resolution. Alan recovers from being shot in the head the same way Zane did. It was a dramatic and symbolic injury, not a fatal one. Saga's call to her daughter goes through. Her family and reality is restored. Alex Casey is fine, just fine. It's a happy ending, which is curious. It's understood that someone had to pay the price in a story like this. It's the central premise on which the ending of both Alan Wake 1 and 2 operate. If that wasn't the magic, then Return would have simply come true. So, who pays the price? It's satisfying in a certain way to have a happy ending. They have all bled and sweat for one. But it doesn't quite fit the genre, does it? I wonder if it has to do with that final writer's journey tape. Alan realizing that he is the master of many worlds might not be so triumphant. It might not be very benign. Really, how could it be benign after all we've seen of Scratch? It is not positive character development for Alan to be even more powerful than ever before. It is suspicious. In Timebreaker, when the leading man went looking for his villain, he found Alan. In Northstar, when Jessie went looking for her brother, she found Alan. In Number One Fan, Rose Marigold went and got her man as well, Alan always having been at the center of her particular universe. The Alan in the writer's journey tapes might have been unhinged, but he was not without some degree of self-clarity. If he was suspicious, then so am I. Someone has to pay the price for a happy ending. And if it's not any of the three of them, then the victim simply remains to be seen. The story was a monster that was defeated, but Alan is the master of many monsters. Zane is still out there. There is much remaining to be seen. The Remedy-connected universe is one of the most intricate and strange constellations of interconnected art there is, peculiar and beautiful in equal measure. Alan Wake 2 has been its metatextual masterpiece and centerpiece. The possibilities from here are limitless, as deep and dark as the waters of Cauldron Lake, as open and free as a fresh page being drawn into an old typewriter before the keys come down to print a new reality upon it. Thanks for watching.
Anybody? Help me! Help me! Can you hear me? Anyone? Please help!
Hello?
Back here. I'm back here. Hey. Mr. Wake?
Oh, hell.
It happened just the way it was on that page. I found. Came true. It knew. So dark. It'll come back for me. You must. The lights. In the office. I have the key.
Okay, Rusty. Hang on. I'll be right back. Whatever did this couldn't be far. Rusty had found a page from the manuscript. It would help me understand what had happened. The searchlight could even the odds. I couldn't hear the dark presence. It was gone. The tunnel was open now.
He tricked me, even with my famously keen perception.
is the fate that awaits you in Night Fringe.
It's Night Springs.
Night Cringe.
Springs.
Bright Blings.
Night Spring.
Fright